Section 32 of History, the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 17, Part 5. After a thorough investigation, the result of the trial of Major Andre was a unanimous opinion of the court-martial that his accusation was just. They reported that Major Andre, Adjutant General to the British Army, ought to be considered as a spy from the enemy, that he came on shore from the Vulture sloop of war in the night of the 21st of September on an interview with General Arnold in a private and secret manner, that he changed his dress within our lines, and under a feigned name and in a disguised habit, passed our works at Stony and Verplank's points, that he was taken in a disguised habit on his way to New York, that he had in his possession several papers which contained intelligence for the enemy, and that, agreeable to the laws and usages of nations, it is their opinion he ought to suffer death. Footnote. The court consisted of 14 very respectable officers, of whom General Greene was president. See Trial of Major Andre. End of footnote. Great interest was made in favor of this young gentleman, whose life had been unimpeached, and whose character promised a distinguished rank in society, both as a man of letters and a soldier. He was elegant in person, amiable in manners, polite, sensible, and brave, but from a misguided zeal for the service of his king, he descended to an assumed and disgraceful character, and by accident and mistake in himself, and the indiscretion and baseness of his untried friend, he found himself ranked with a class held infamous among all civilized nations. The character of a spy has ever been held mean and disgraceful by all classes of men. Yet the most celebrated commanders of all nations have frequently employed some of their bravest and most confidential officers to wear a guise in which, if detected, they were at once subjected to infamy and to the halter. Doubtless, the generals Clinton and Washington were equally culpable in selecting in Andre and a Hale to hazard all the hopes of youth and talents on the precarious tie of executing with success a business to which so much deception and baseness is attached. But the fate of Andre was lamented by the enemies of his nation. His sufferings were soothed by the politeness and generosity of the commander-in-chief and the officers of the American army. The gloom of imprisonment was cheered in part, and the terrors of death mitigated by the friendly intercourse and converse of benevolent minds, and the tear of compassion was drawn from every pitying eye that beheld this accomplished youth, a victim to the usages of war, while the unfortunate Hale, detected in the effort of gaining intelligence of the designs of the enemies of his country, in the same clandestine manner, had been hanged in the city of New York without a day lent to pause on the awful transition from time to eternity. Footnote. See an account of Captain Hale's execution in the British Remembrancer and other historical records. End of footnote. This event took place soon after the action on Long Island, the dilemma to which he was reduced, and the situation of his army rendered it expedient for General Washington to endeavor to gain some intelligence of the designs and subsequent operations of Sir William Howe and the army under his command. This being intimated by Colonel Smallwood to Captain Hale, a young gentleman of unimpeachable character and rising hopes, he generously offered to risk his life for the service of his country in the perilous experiment. He ventured into the city, was detected, and with the same frankness and liberality of mind that marked the character of Andre, acknowledged that he was employed in a business that could not be forgiven by his enemies, and without the smallest trait of compassion from anyone. He was cruelly insulted and executed with disgraceful rigor. Nor was he permitted to bid a melancholy adieu to his friends by conveying letters to inform them of the fatal catastrophe that prematurely robbed them of a beloved son. The lives of two such valuable young officers, thus cut off in the morning of expectation, were similar in everything but the treatment they received from the hands of their enemies. The reader will draw the parallel, or the contrast, between the conduct of the British and the Americans, on an occasion that demanded equal humanity and tenderness from every beholder, and make his own comment. A personal interview at the request of Sir Henry Clinton took place between the Generals Robertson and Greene, and everything in the power of ingenuity, humanity, or affection was proposed by General Robertson to prevent the fate of the unhappy Andre. It was urged that he went from the Vulture under the sanction of a flag, and that General Arnold had, as he had a right to do, admitted him within the American lines. But Major Andre had too much sincerity to make use of any subterfuge, not founded in truth. In the course of his examination, he, with the utmost candor, acknowledged that it was impossible for him to suppose he came on shore under the sanction of a flag. The propriety and dignity with which he had written to General Washington on his first becoming a prisoner, the acknowledgment of his rank and condition in life, the manner of his detection, the accident of his being betrayed within the American posts, and indeed such was his whole deportment that the feelings of humanity forbade a wish for the operation of the rigorous maxims of war. It was thought necessary that he should be adjudged the victim of policy, but resentment towards him was never harbored in any bosom. He gratefully acknowledged the kindness and civilities he received from the American officers, but he wished some amelioration of some part of his sentence. His sensibility was wounded by the manner in which he was doomed to die. He wrote General Washington the day before his execution that, buoyed above the terror of death by the consciousness of a life devoted to honorable pursuits, stained with no action that can give me remorse, I trust that the request I make to your Excellency at this severe period, and which is to soften my last moments, will not be rejected. Sympathy towards a soldier will surely induce you to adapt the mode of my death to the feelings of a man of honor. Let me hope, sir, that if aught in my character impresses you with esteem towards me, if aught in my misfortunes marks me the victim of policy, not of resentment, I shall experience the operation of those feelings in your breast by being informed I am not to die on a gibbet. This his last and pathetic request, to die as a soldier and a man of honor, not as a criminal. The severity of military rules pronounced inadmissible, and this gallant and amiable young officer fell as a traitor amidst the armies of America, but without a personal enemy. Every tongue acceded to the justice of his sentence, yet every eye dropped a tear at the necessity of its execution. Many persons, from the impulse of humanity, thought that General Washington might, consistently with his character as a soldier and a patriot, have ameliorated the sentence of death so far as to have saved, at his own earnest request, this amiable young man from the ignominy of a gallows, by permitting him to die in a mode more consonant to the ideas of the brave, the honorable, and the virtuous. When General Arnold was first apprised of the detection of Major Andre, and that he was conducted to headquarters, he was struck with astonishment and terror, and in the agitation and agonies of a madman, he called for a horse, mounted instantly, and rode down a craggy steep, never before explored on horseback. He took a barge, and under a flag he passed for a plank's point, and soon found himself safe beneath the guns of the Vulture sloop of war. Before he took leave of the bargemen, he made them very generous offers if they would act as dishonorably as he had done. He promised them higher and better wages if they would desert their country and enlist in the service of Britain. But they spurned at the offer and were permitted to return. Perhaps, had these American watermen been apprised of the full extent of Arnold's criminality, they would have acted with as much resolution as the trio who seized Major Andre and have secured Arnold, when he might have suffered the punishment he deserved. After Arnold had got safe to New York, he wrote to General Washington on behalf of his wife, endeavored to justify his own conduct and his appointment in conference with Andre, claimed his right to send a flag to the enemy for any purposes he might think proper, while he held a respectable command in the American army, and urged the release of Major Andre with art, insolence, and address. He did not stop here, but on the 7th of October, 5 days after the execution of Andre, he sent out an address to the people of America, fabricated under the auspices of his new masters, and couched in very insolent and overbearing language. He cast many indecent reflections on Congress, on his countrymen, on the French nation, and on the alliance between America and France. Soon after his arrival in New York, he received the price of his fidelity, 10,000 pounds sterling in cash, and of his honor in a new commission under the crown of Great Britain. The Generals Clinton and Robertson did everything to save the life of their favorite Andre, except delivering up the traitor Arnold. To this exchange, General Washington would readily have acceded, but a proposal of this nature could not be admitted, for however beloved or esteemed the individual may be, personal regards must yield to political exigencies. Thus, while the accomplished Andre was permitted to die by the hand of the common executioner, the infamous Arnold was caressed, rewarded, and promoted to high rank in the British Army. The American government was not remiss in all proper encouragement to signal instances of faithful attachment to the interest and service of their country. Congress ordered that the 3 private soldiers who had rejected the office of Andre on his detection should each of them be presented with a silver medal, $200 annually during life, and the thanks of Congress, acknowledging the high sense they retained to the virtuous conduct of Paulding, Williams, and Van Wert. Sir Henry Clinton has so high an opinion of General Arnold's military abilities, and placed such entire confidence in this infamous traitor to his country, that he vested him with commands of high trust and importance, and for a time placed his sole dependence on him for the ravage of the borders of Virginia. He had now the sole command in the Chesapeake, and by his rapacity he was qualified to surprise and plunder. His talents for prosecuting hostilities by unexpected attack and massacre were well known in both armies, but affairs in Virginia beginning to wear a more serious aspect, General Clinton thought it not proper to leave General Arnold to his own discretion for any length of time without the support and assistance of officers of more respectable character, who we shall see were appointed and sent forward the beginning of the next year. End of section 32. Section 33 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 17, Conclusion. We leave the operations of the British commanders in their several departments for the present, and again advert to some interesting circumstances and new disappointments that took place towards the close of the present year, and fill the mind of every true American with the utmost concern. There had yet been no treaty or public stipulations between the United States and any foreign nation except France, but circumstances had been ripening to bring forward immediate negotiations with the Dutch Republic. Holland was at this period in a more delicate situation than almost any other European power. Great Britain claimed her as an ally and held up the obligations of patronage and protection in strong language. But the nature of the dispute between Great Britain and her transatlantic domains, as well as the commercial views of the Belgian provinces, interested the merchants, the burgomasters, and the pensioners of Holland in favor of America, while the partiality of the stadtholder, his family, and the court connections were altogether British, or at least the motives of interest, affection, or fear held them up in that light. In the intermediate time, the clandestine assistance given by the Dutch merchants was very advantageous to America, and the private encouragement of some of the magistrates of the United Netherlands that a treaty of alliance and the strictest amity might in time be accomplished between the two republics heightened the expectations of the American Congress. None of the principal characters among the Batavians were more zealously interested in the success of the American struggle for independence than Robert Jasper van der Capellen, Lord of March. This worthy Dutchman, as early as the 7th of December, 1778, had solicited a correspondence with several of the most prominent characters in America. A more correct and judicious correspondent he could not have selected than Governor Trumbull of Connecticut, whose merits as a man, a patriot, and a Christian cannot be too highly appreciated. This gentleman was distinguished in each line of this triple character. As a man, his abilities were conspicuous, his comprehension clear, and his judgment correct. The sedateness of his mind qualified him for the patriot and the friend of a young and growing country, whose manufactures had been checked, her commerce cramped, and their liberties, for the enjoyment of which they had fled to a distant world, curtailed. And in no instance did he ever deviate from the principles of the Revolution. His uniform conduct as a Christian was not less signal. His integrity and uprightness, his benevolence and piety, and the purity and simplicity of his manners, through a long life, approached as near the example of the primitive patterns of a sublime religion as that of anyone raised to eminence of office, who, by the flatteries of their fellow men, are too often led to forget themselves, their country, and their God. The Baron van der Capellen was a zealous supporter of the Americans in their claim to independence, and predisposed many of his countrymen to unite cordially with them and enter into treaties of amity and commerce, previous to the arrival of a minister at The Hague to negotiate on that subject. In one of his letters to Governor Trumbull, he had observed that among other causes of distrust in relation to the credit of America was the false intelligence which the English incessantly circulate, the effects of which the friends of the Americans cannot destroy for the want of information, that it was of the last importance to enable them by authentic relations, which should contain nothing but what was precisely true, and in which even the disadvantages inseparable from the chances of war should not be concealed, in order to enable them from time to time to give an idea of the actual state of things and of what is really passing on the other side of the ocean. He added, "If you choose, sir, to honor me with such a correspondence, be assured that I shall make a proper use of it. Communications apparently in confidence have a much stronger influence than those which appear in public." He observed that a description of the present state and advantages of United America, of the forms of government in its different republics, of the facility with which strangers there may establish themselves and find a subsistence, of the price of lands, both cultivated and unimproved, of cattle, provisions, etc., with a succinct history of the present war, and the cruelties committed by the English, would excite astonishment in a country where America is known but through the medium of the gazettes. Governor Trumbull had not hesitated to comply with this request. He had detailed a succinct narrative of past and present circumstances and the future prospects of America, for a part of which the reader is referred to the Appendix. Footnote: Governor Trumbull observed thus: "The only obstacle which I foresee to the settlement of foreigners in the country will be the taxes, which must inevitably for a time run high, for the payment of the debts contracted during the present war. These, indeed, will be much lightened by the care which has been taken to confine these debts as much as possible among ourselves, and by emitting a paper currency in place of borrowing from abroad. But this method, though it secures the country from being drained hereafter of immense sums of solid coin, which can never return, has exposed us to a new and very disagreeable embarrassment by its monstrous depreciation, an evil which had its rise in, and owes all its rapid increase to the single cause of our not having provided at a sufficiently early period for its reduction and payment by taxes. This measure was indeed rendered impracticable at the proper time by the radical derangement of the system of government, and consequently of revenue in many of the United States, and its necessary delay till the removal of these impediments gave time for avarice and suspicion to unite in sapping the foundations of our internal credit." He adds, "I am no advocate for internal or foreign loans. In my opinion, they are like cold water in a fever, which allays the disease for a moment, but soon causes it to rage with redoubled violence. Temporary alleviations, but ultimately real additions to the burden. The debts which we have already contracted, or may hereafter be necessitated to contract abroad, I have not a doubt but will be paid with the utmost punctuality and honor. And there can be no surer foundation of credit than we possess in the rapidly increasing value and importance of our country. In short, it is not so much my wish that the United States should gain credit among foreign nations for the loan of money, as that all nations, and especially your countrymen in Holland, should be made acquainted with the real state of the American war, the importance and greatness of this rising empire, the future extensive value of our commerce, the advantages of colonization, are objects which need only to be known to command your attention, protection, and support. Give me leave most sincerely to express my grief that the effort you have made for the removal of oppression in your own country, and for extending the blessings of liberty and plenty to the poor, should have met with so ungrateful a return of persecution and insult. Unhappy state of man, where opulence and power conspire to load the poor, the defenseless, and the innocent with accumulated misery, where an unworthy few join to embitter the life of half their fellow men, that they may wallow in the excess of luxurious debauch, or shine in the splendid trappings of folly. End of footnote. The Baron Capellan observes on the above letter of this gentleman that it was to be regretted that so handsome, so energetic a defense of the American cause should be shut up in the portfolio of an individual, that he had communicated it with discretion in Amsterdam, and that it had made a very strong impression on all who had read it. These favorable dispositions among many persons of high consideration in the United Netherlands, whose ancestors had suffered so much to secure their own liberties, led Congress to expect their aid and support in a contest so interesting to Republican opinion and the general freedom of mankind. It forbade any farther delay in the councils of America. Congress were convinced no time was to be lost, but that a minister with proper credentials should immediately appear in a public character at The Hague, or if that should be found inadmissible, that he should have instructions to regulate any private negotiations according to the dictates of judgment, discretion, or necessity. Accordingly, early in the present year, the Honorable Henry Lawrence of South Carolina, late President of the Continental Congress, was vested with this important commission. Perhaps a more judicious choice of a public minister could not have been made throughout the states. From his prudence, probity, politeness, and knowledge of the world, Mr. Laurens was confident to the trust and well qualified for the execution thereof. But he was unfortunately captured on his way by Admiral Edwards, carried to Newfoundland, and from thence sent to England, where he experienced all the rigors of severity usually inflicted on state criminals. Before Mr. Laurens left the foggy atmosphere of Newfoundland, an apparent instance of the deep-rooted jealousy harbored in the breasts of the British officers against all Americans who fell into their hands was discovered by the refusal of Admiral Edwards to permit, at Mr. Laurens' request, Mr. Winslow Warren to accompany him to Europe in the frigate in which he sailed. This youth was the son of a gentleman who had been vested with some of the first and most respectable offices of trust and importance in America. He was captured on his way to Europe a few weeks before Mr. Laurens, to whom he had introductory letters from some of the first characters in America, to be delivered on his arrival at The Hague. Their unfortunate meeting as prisoners on this dreary spot gave him an early opportunity to present them. No cartel had yet been settled for the exchange of prisoners, and sensibly touched with compassion for their sufferings, Mr. Warren voluntarily engaged to remain as a hostage till that arrangement might take place. The Admiral consented to send a great number of Americans to Boston, on Mr. Warren's word of honor that an equal number of British prisoners would be returned. Mr. Laurens wished to anticipate his release from the generous feelings of his own mind, as well as from the delicacy of sentiment and the accomplished manners of Mr. Warren, and though they were both treated with the utmost politeness by Admiral Edwards, he refused to gratify these gentlemen in their mutual wishes to be fellow passengers, as they were fellow prisoners. But the Admiral permitted Mr. Warren, within 3 or 4 days after Mr. Laurens' departure, to take passage in another frigate, bound directly to England. Mr. Laurens took an affectionate leave of Mr. Warren, and requested him to write his friends, or to tell them if he reached America before him, that, though he was an old man, who had recently lost all his estates in Charleston by the capture of that city, and had now lost his liberty, that he was still the same, firm, cheerful, and unruffled by the shocks of fortune. When Mr. Laurens arrived in England, he was committed to the Tower, confined to very narrow apartments, and denied all intercourse with his friends. There Mr. Warren saw him when he arrived in England, near enough to exchange a salute, but they were not permitted to speak to each other. It is observable that the defection of General Arnold and the capture of Mr. Laurens took place within a few days of each other. These two circumstances operated on the passions of men in a contrasted point of view. The treachery of Arnold was beheld with irritation and disdain by his former military associates, and with the utmost disgust and abhorrence through all America. The fate of Mr. Laurens awakened the better feelings of the human heart. As an individual of the highest respectability, all who knew him were pained with apprehensions, lest he should be subjected to personal danger or sufferings. As a diplomatic officer, the first public character that had been sent to the Batavian provinces, it was feared his captivity and detention might have an unfavorable effect on the foreign relations of America, and particularly on their connection with Holland. Indeed, a variety of circumstances that took place through the summer and autumn of this did not augur the most propitious promises relative to the operations of the next year. End of section 33. Section 34 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2, by Mercy Otis Warren, Chapter 18, Part 1. Revolt of the Pennsylvania Line, discontents in other parts of the Army, paper medium sunk, some active movements of Don Bernard de Galvez in America, war between Great Britain and Spain opened in Europe by the siege of Gibraltar, short view of diplomatic transactions between America and several European powers. Empress of Russia refuses to treat with the American states. We have already seen the double disappointment experienced by the United States, occasioned by the capture of one army in South Carolina under General Lincoln, and the defeat of another commanded by General Gates in North Carolina, who was sent forward with the highest expectations of retrieving affairs in that quarter. We have seen the complicated embarrassments of the United States relative to raising, paying, and supporting a permanent army. We have seen the pernicious effects of a depreciating currency and the beginning of a spirit of peculation and regard to private interest that was not expected from the former habits and professions of Americans. We have seen the disappointments and delay relative to foreign negotiations. We have seen both the patient sufferings of the American army under the greatest necessity and the rising restlessness that soon pervaded nearly the whole body of the soldiery. And we have also seen the desertion of a general officer, in whom confidence had been placed as a man of courage. We left Arnold stigmatized as a traitor, and in all the pride and insolence of a British general, newly vested with command and reward of villainy, beginning under the British standard, his career of ravage and depredation in Virginia. In addition to the alarming circumstances already recapitulated at the close of the preceding year, the most dangerous symptoms were exhibited in the conduct of a part of the army, which broke out in revolt, and the secession of the whole Pennsylvania line spread a temporary dismay. On the 1st of January, 1781, upwards of 1,000 men belonging to that line marched in a body from the camp. Others, equally disaffected, soon followed them. They took an advantageous ground, chose for their leader a sergeant major, a British deserter, and saluted him as their major general. On the third day of their revolt, a message was sent from the officers of the American camp. This they refused to receive, but to a flag which followed, requesting to know their complaints and intentions, they replied that they had served 3 years, that they had engaged to serve no longer, nor would they return or disperse until their grievances were redressed and their arrearages paid. General Wayne, who commanded the line, had been greatly beloved and respected by the soldiery, nor did he at first himself doubt but that his influence would soon bring them back to their duty. He did everything in the power of a spirited and judicious officer to dissipate their murmurs and to quiet their clamors in the beginning of the insurrection. But many of them pointed their bayonets at his breast, told him to be on his guard, that they were determined to march to Congress to obtain a redress of grievances, and that, though they respected him as an officer and loved his person, yet if he attempted to fire on them, he was a dead man. Sir Henry Clinton soon gained intelligence of the confusion and danger into which the Americans were plunged. He improved the advantageous moment and made the revolters every tempting offer to increase and fix their defection. He sent several persons to offer in his name a pardon for all past offenses, an immediate payment of their full demands on Congress, and protection from the British government. He desired them to send proper persons to Amboy to treat farther, and engaged that a body of British troops was ready for their escort. Footnote: see Sir Henry Clinton's letter to Lord George Germain, January 1781. End of footnote. How far the conduct of Sir Henry Clinton is to be justified by the laws of war, we leave to the decision of military characters, but to the impartial spectator, Though so often practiced by officers of consideration and name, it appears an underhand interference beneath the character of a brave and generous commander, to stimulate by those secret methods a discontented class of soldiers to turn the points of their swords against their country and their former friends. But the intrigues of the British officers and the measures of their commander-in-chief had not the smallest influence. The revolted line, though dissatisfied and disgusted, appeared to have no inclination to join the British army. They declared with one general voice that there was an immediate necessity to call out the American forces. They would still fight under the orders of the congressional officers. Several British spies were detected, busily employed in endeavoring to increase the ferment, who were tried and executed with little ceremony. The prudent conduct of the commander-in-chief, and the disposition which appeared in government to do justice to their troops, subdued the spirit of mutiny. A respectable committee was sent from Congress to hear their complaints, and as far as possible to relieve their sufferings. Those whose term of enlistment was expired were paid off and discharged, the reasonable demands of others satisfied, and a general pardon granted to the offenders, who returned cheerfully to their duty. The discontented and mutinous spirit of the troops was not, however, entirely eradicated. The sources of disquietude in an army, situated like the present, were too many to suppress at once. They were without pay, without clothing sufficient for the calls of nature, and not satisfied with the assurances of future compensation. Their murmurs were too general, and their complaints loud and pressing. The contagion of the mutinous example of the Pennsylvania line had spread in some degree its dangerous influence over other parts of the army. It operated more particularly on the part of the Jersey troops, soon after the pacification of the disorderly Pennsylvania soldiers, though not with equal success and impunity to themselves. They were unexpectedly surrounded by a detachment from the main body of the army and ordered to parade without their arms. On discovering some reluctance to obey, Colonel Sprout of the Massachusetts Division was directed to advance with a party and demand their compliance within 5 minutes. As their numbers were not sufficient for resistance, they submitted without opposition. A few of the principal leaders of the revolt were tried by a court-martial and adjudged guilty. As a second general pardon, without any penal inflictions, would have had a fatal effect on the army. 2 of them suffered death for their mutinous conduct. This example of severity put a period to every symptom of open revolt, though not to the silent murmurs of the American army. They still felt heavily the immediate inconveniences of the deficiency of almost every article necessary to life. They had little subsistence, and seldom any covering, except what was forced from the adjacent inhabitants by military power. These circumstances were aggravated by the little prospect there still appeared of filling their battalions and establishing a permanent army. Every evil had been enhanced, and every pleasing anticipation darkened, by the general stagnation of paper money, previous to the absolute death of such a ruinous medium of intercourse between man and man. It had created suspicion and apprehension in every mind, and led everyone reluctantly to part with their specie before they knew the fate of a currency, agonizing in the last pangs of dissolution. The successes at the northward had indeed given a spring to expectation and action, but the gloomy appearances of affairs at the southward, the ineffective movements in the central states, and the perseverance of the King and Parliament of Britain in their measures against the colonies, notwithstanding their recent connection with a potent foreign power, wrapped in the clouds of uncertainty, the final termination of the present conflict. These were discouragements that in theory might be thought insurmountable, but American independence was an object of too great magnitude to sink under the temporary evils or the adventitious circumstances of war. That great source of moral turpitude, the circulating paper, which had languished the last year until without sinew or nerve for any effective purpose, died of itself in the present, without any visible wound, except from the immense quantity counterfeited in New York and elsewhere under British influence. In a confidential letter to Lord George Germain about this time, General Clinton observed that the experiments suggested by your lordship have been tried. No assistances that could be drawn from the power of gold or the arts of counterfeiting have been left unattempted, but still the currency, like the widow's cruse of oil, has not failed. It is true indeed that the currency answered most of the purposes of Congress for some time after the date of the letter from which the above extract is taken, when the paper ceased to circulate. No one mourned or seemed to feel its loss, nor was it succeeded by any stagnation of business or derangement of order. Everyone rejoiced at the annihilation of such a deceptive medium, in full hope that confidence between neighbor and neighbor, which this had destroyed, would again be restored. The immense heaps of paper trash, denominated money, which had been ushered into existence from necessity, were from equal necessity locked up in darkness, there to wait some renovating day to reinstamp some degree of value on what had deceived many into an ideal opinion that they possessed property. It was not long after this paper intercourse ceased before silver and gold appeared in circulation, sufficient for a medium of trade and other purposes of life. Much of it was brought from the hoarded bags of the miser, who had concealed it in vaults instead of lending it to his distressed countrymen, and much more of the precious metals were put into circulation by the sums sent from Europe to support a British army in captivity, and for the pay of the fleets and troops of France, which were sent forward to the assistance of the Americans. Notwithstanding all the baneful evils of a currency of only a nominal value that fluctuates from day to day, it would have been impossible for the colonies to have carried on a war in opposition to the power of Great Britain without this paper substitute for real specie. They were not opulent, though a competence had generally followed their industry. There were few among themselves wealthy enough to loan money for public purposes. Foreigners were long shy, and appeared evidently reluctant at the idea of depositing their monies in the hands of a government with whom they had but recently commenced an acquaintance. End of section 34. Section 35 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 18, Part 2. France, indeed, after the Declaration of Independence, generously lent of her treasures to support the claims of liberty and of the United States against the strong hand of Britain. But Spain kept her fingers on the strings of her purse. Though, as observed above, America had sent several agents to the court of Madrid to solicit aid, nor was it until the year 1782 that even Holland opened hers to any effective purpose for the pecuniary cause that accumulated beneath the waste of war, in which their sister republic was involved. A few observations on the eventful transactions which took place among the nations of Europe this year may here be properly introduced, before a farther continuance of the narrative of the war. This is necessary to give a clearer idea of the connection brought forward between America and several foreign nations, besides France and Spain, before the pride of Great Britain could condescend to acknowledge the independence of the United States. Previous to Lord Cornwallis's last campaign in America, most of the belligerent powers in Europe had stood aloof, in a posture of expectation rather than immediate action, as waiting the events of time to avail themselves of cooperation when convenient with that side that might offer the greatest advantage when weighed in the political scale by which the interest of all nations is generally balanced. France had long since acknowledged the independence of America, and the whole House of Bourbon now supported the claim of the United States, though there had yet been no direct treaty between America and Spain. It had been the general expectation for some time before it took place that Spain would finally unite with France in support of the American cause. From this expectation, the Spaniards in South America had prepared themselves for a rupture a considerable time before any formal declaration of war had taken place between the courts of Madrid and St. James. They were in readiness to take the earliest advantage of such an event. They had accordingly seized Pensacola in West Florida and several British posts on the Mississippi before the troops stationed there had any intimation that hostilities were denounced in the usual style between the crowns of England and Spain. Don Bernard de Galvez, governor of Louisiana, had proclaimed the independence of America at New Orleans, at the head of all the forces he could collect, as early as the 19th of August, 1779, and had proceeded immediately to surprise and conquer, wherever he could, the unguarded settlements claimed by the Crown of Britain. The British Navy, generally masters of the ocean, had, early after hostilities commenced, beaten some of the Spanish ships, intercepted the convoys, and captured or destroyed several of the homeward-bound fleets of merchantmen. But by the time we are upon, the arms of Spain had been successful in several enterprises by sea. At the Bay of Honduras and in the West Indies, they also soon after gained several other advantages of some moment. Don Bernard de Galvez had concerted a plan with the governor of the Havana to surprise Mobile. He encountered storms, dangers, disappointments, and difficulties almost innumerable. This enterprising Spaniard recovered, however, in some measure, his losses, and receiving a reinforcement from the Havana, with a part of the regiment of Navarre and some other auxiliaries, he repaired to and landed near Mobile. He summoned the garrison to surrender, who, after a short defense, hung out a white flag, and a capitulation took place by which the English garrison surrendered themselves prisoners of war. In Europe, the war had been opened on the side of Spain by the siege of Gibraltar. This strong fortress had been closely invested by a powerful fleet and army for some time. The piratical states of Barbary, who, to the disgrace of Europe, were permitted to war upon or to make tributary all the nations, had been recently disgusted with Great Britain, and such a defection had taken place that no relief could be expected from that quarter, or any supplies of provisions obtained from them for the garrison, which was reduced to such distress that they were several weeks without bread, except a few worm-eaten biscuits sold at an enormous price. A guinea was refused for a calf's head, a chicken sold for 9 shillings sterling, and everything else proportionately scarce and dear, until the hardy British veterans found they could subsist on the scanty allowance of a gill or two of rice per day. But by the unexampled intrepidity of General Elliot and the equal bravery of Boyd, the second in command, by the courage and perseverance of many gallant British officers, and the spirit and constitutional valor of their troops, the garrison was enabled to resist and to hold out amidst the distresses of famine and against the most tremendous attack and bombardment that perhaps ever took place. A prodigious number of cannon of the heaviest size and a vast apparatus of mortars at once spouted their torrents of fire and brimstone on that barren rock. With equal horror and sublimity, the blaze was poured back by the besieged with little intermission. The sheets of flame were spread over the adjacent seas and the shipping for 3 or 4 weeks, when the magnanimous officers in the garrison, who had been for 4 days together without provisions of any kind, except a few kernels of rice and a small quantity of moldy bread, were relieved by the arrival of Admiral Rodney on his way to the West Indies. He was accompanied by a British fleet under the command of Admiral Digby, who continued there with a number of ships sufficient for defense and for the security of a large number of Spanish prizes taken by Admiral Rodney. He had fallen in with the fleet of 11 heavy ships of the line, commanded by Don Juan Langara, who, after being dangerously wounded and his ship reduced to a wreck, yielded to the superiority of the British flag, as did the San Julian, commanded by the Marquis Modena, and indeed nearly the whole of the Spanish fleet. Notwithstanding the reduction of Gibraltar was suspended, we shall see the object was not relinquished. More formidable exertions were made the next year by the combined forces of France and Spain for the completion of this favorite project. It was indeed some time after the accession of Spain, before any other European power explicitly acknowledged the independence of the United States. But Mr. Izard, who was sent to Tuscany, and Mr. William Lee to the court of Vienna, in 1778, inspired with that lively assurance which is sometimes the pledge of success, had met with no discouraging circumstances. Holland had a still more difficult part to act than France, Spain, or perhaps any other European power, who actually had adhered to, or appeared inclined to favor, the cause of America. Her embarrassments arose in part from existing treaties with Great Britain, by which the latter claimed the Dutch Republic as their ally, reproached her with ingratitude, and intimated that by former engagements that republic was bound in all cases to act offensively and defensively with the court of Great Britain. Thus the measures of the Batavian provinces were long impeded by the intrigues of the British minister and the English faction at The Hague, before their high mightinesses acceded to the acknowledgment of American independence. We have seen before that the friendly disposition of the Batavians towards America was such, in the particular situation of both republics, as to render it at once rational and expedient for the American Congress to send a public minister to reside at The Hague. Mr. Lawrence, as already related, was appointed, sent forward, captured on his way, and detained for some time at Newfoundland. The unfortunate capture of the American envoy prevented for a time all public negotiations with Holland. He had been vested with discretionary powers, and had suitable instructions given him to enter into private contracts and negotiations as exigencies might offer for the interest of his country, until events were ripened for his full admission as ambassador from the United States of America. Mr. Lawrence was captured at some leagues' distance from Newfoundland. When he found his own fate was inevitable, he neglected no precaution to prevent the public papers in his possession from falling into the hands of his enemies. The British commander knew not the rank of his prisoner, until the packages seasonably thrown overboard by Mr. Lawrence were recovered by a British sailor, who had the courage to plunge into the sea with so much celerity as to prevent them from sinking. By these papers a full discovery was made, not only of the nature of Mr. Lawrence's commission, but of the dispositions of the Batavians to aid the exertions beyond the Atlantic for the liberties of mankind. Their own freedom was a prize for which their ancestors had struggled for more than 70 years against the strong hand of despotism before they obtained the independence of their country. In Mr. Lawrence's trunk thus recovered was found a plan of a treaty of alliance between the states of Holland and the United States of America. Also, letters from the pensioner of Amsterdam, with many communications and letters from the principal gentlemen and merchants in that and many other cities in the Dutch provinces. Admiral Edwards considered the capture of Mr. Lawrence as so important that he immediately ordered a frigate to England with the conveyance of this gentleman and the evidences of the commission on which he had been sent out. These important papers received in England, Sir Joseph Yorke, the British minister resident at The Hague, was directed by the king, his master, to lay the whole of these transactions before their high mightinesses, the States General of the United Provinces. End of section 35. Section 36 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 18, Conclusion. The British minister complained loudly, and in terms of high resentment, of the injuries and insults offered to Great Britain by the ungrateful conduct of the Republic of Holland. He urged that secretly supplying the rebellious colonies with the accoutrements for war was a step not to be forgiven, that what had been suspected before now appeared clearly, and that he had the evidences in his hand, and the names of the principal conspirators, that the Belgic provinces were countenancing public negotiations, and on the point of executing treaties of amity and commerce with the revolted Americans. He informed the States General that the King of England demanded prompt satisfaction for these offenses, that as a proof of the disavowal of these measures, he required immediate and exemplary punishment to be inflicted on the pensioner von Berkel and his accomplices, as disturbers of the public peace and violators of the law of nations. Notwithstanding the resentment of the British envoy, the conduct of the Dutch court remained for some time so equivocal that neither Great Britain or America was fully satisfied with their determinations. It is true, a treaty with the United States was for some time postponed, but the answer of their high mightinesses to the memorial and remonstrances of Sir Joseph Yorke, not being sufficiently condescending and decided, his disgust daily increased. He informed his court in very disadvantageous terms of the effect of his repeated memorials, of the conduct of their high mightinesses, and of that of the principal characters of the Batavian provinces at large. Great Britain soon after, in the recess of Parliament, amidst all her other difficulties, at war with France, Spain, and America, and left alone by all the other powers of Europe to decide her own quarrels, announced hostilities against the Netherlands, and a long manifesto from the king was sent abroad in the latter parts of December 1780. A declaration of war against the Republic of Holland by the King of Great Britain was very unpleasing to most of the northern powers. The Baron Novgin, the Swedish ambassador resident at the court of London, remonstrated against it in a state paper, in which he observed that the flame of war, kindled in another hemisphere, had communicated to Europe, but the King of Sweden still flattered himself that this conflagration would not extend beyond its first bounds, and particularly that a nation entirely commercial, which had made neutrality the invariable foundation of its conduct, would not have been enveloped in it, and yet, nevertheless, this has happened, almost in the very moment when that power had entered into the most inoffensive engagements with the king and his two northern allies. If the most exact impartiality that was ever observed could not exempt the king from immediately feeling the inconveniences of war, by the considerable losses sustained by his commercial subjects, he had much greater reason to apprehend the consequences when those troubles were going to be extended, when an open war between Great Britain and the Republic of Holland multiplied them, and to conclude, when neutral commerce was about to endure new shackles by the hostilities committed between those two powers, he added, the king could not, but wished sincerely that the measures taken by the Empress of Russia for extinguishing this new war in its beginning might be crowned with the most perfect success. But indifferent to the remonstrances and memorials of the potentates of Europe, Great Britain, hostile, wealthy, powerful, and proud, appeared regardless of their resentment and ready to bid defiance and spread the waste of war among all nations. The capture of Mr. Lawrence was, however, no small embarrassment to the British ministry. Their pride would not suffer them to recognize his public character. They dared not condemn him as a rebel. The independence of America was too far advanced, and there were too many captured noblemen and officers in the United States to think of such a step, lest immediate retaliation should be made, and his business was found too consequential to admit of his release. He was confined in the Tower, forbidden the use of pen, ink, and paper, and all social intercourse with anyone, and was even interdicted to any converse with a young son who had been several years in England for his education. There he suffered a long imprisonment at his own expense until many months had elapsed, and many unexpected events had taken place that made it expedient to offer him his liberty without any equivalent. This he refused to accept from the feelings of honor, as Congress at that time had offered General Burgoyne in exchange for Mr. Lawrence. The integrity of Mr. Lawrence could not be warped either by flatteries or menaces, though his health was much impaired by his severe and incommodious confinement. It was intimated to him, at a certain period of his imprisonment, that it might operate in his favor if he would advise his son, Colonel John Lawrence, to withdraw himself from the court of France, where he was then executing with success a commission from Congress to negotiate a loan of money and solicit farther aid, both by sea and land, in behalf of the American states. The firmness of Mr. Lawrence was not shaken by the proposal. He replied with equal confidence both in affection of his son and the delicacy of his honor. He observed that such was the filial regard of his son that he knew he would not hesitate to forfeit his life for his father, but that no consideration would induce Colonel Lawrence to relinquish his honor, even were it possible for any circumstances to prevail on his father to make the improper request. Immediately after the news of Mr. Lawrence's capture, imprisonment, and detention in England, the American Congress directed John Adams, Esquire, who had a second time been sent to Europe in a public character, to leave France and repair to Holland, there to transact affairs with the States General, which had before been entrusted to the fidelity of Mr. Lawrence. Mr. Adams's commission was enlarged from a confidence in his talents and integrity. He was vested with ample powers for negotiation, for the forming treaties of alliance, commerce, or the loan of monies for the United States of America. Not fettered by instructions, we shall see he exercised his discretionary powers with judgment and ability. Thus, in strict amity with France and Spain, on the point of a treaty of alliance with the Batavian Republic, Sweden and Denmark balancing, and nearly determined on a connection with America, her foreign relations in general wore a very favorable aspect. The Empress of Russia only, among the European nations, where an intercourse was opened, refused peremptorily to receive any minister at her court under the authority of the Congress of the United States of America. Overtures were made to the haughty sovereign of the Russian Empire, early enough to evince the high consideration in which her arms and her character were viewed in America, as well as in Europe, but without the least shadow of success. Determined to maintain her independent dignity and hold the neutral position she had chosen, she did not even deign to see the person sent on by Congress to act as agent at the court of Petersburg. But she concluded the business with the policy of the statesman, the address of her sex, and the superiority of the Empress Catherine. It was indeed doubted by many at the time whether Mr. Dana was qualified to act as envoy at the court of Russia and to negotiate with such a potent state. He was undoubtedly a man of understanding, with a due share of professional knowledge, having been for several years an attorney of eminence. But it was thought that he had not either the address, the penetration, the knowledge of courts, or of the human character, necessary for a negotiator at the court of a despotic female, at the head of a nation of machines, under the absolute control of herself and her favorites. It requires equanimity of temper, as well as true greatness of soul, to command or retain the respect of great statesmen and politicians. Distinguished talents and a pleasing address were peculiarly necessary for a negotiator at the court of Russia, both from the character of the nation and the monarch. The Russians were sanguine and revengeful, and ready by their precipitate counsels to aid their arbitrary mistress in her bold designs and despotic mandates, while she, as the dictatress of Europe, determined the ruin of princes and the annihilation of kingdoms. On the earliest notice of an application from the Congress of the United States, the Empress, after several expressions of civility, containing a respectful regard to the interests of the American states, made all proper acknowledgments to them for the attention paid to herself. She had before granted them the free navigation of the Baltic, in spite of the remonstrances of the British minister resident at Petersburg against it. She, however, ordered her minister to inform the American envoy that, as mediatrix with the Emperor of Germany and the King of Prussia, relative to the disputes subsisting between France, Spain, and Great Britain, she thought it improper for her to acknowledge the independence of America until the result of the mediation was known, because the provisional articles depended on the definitive treaty. That, when the latter was completed, she should be ready to proceed in the business, but that it would be highly improper for her to treat with America as an independent state, by virtue of powers or credentials issued previous to the acknowledgement of American independence by the King of Great Britain. That her delicacy was a law to her, not to take before that time a step which might not be considered as corresponding with those which have characterized her strict neutrality during the course of the late war, notwithstanding which, the Empress repeats that you may enjoy, not only for your own honor, but also for your countrymen, who may come into her empire on commercial business or otherwise, the most favorable reception and the protection of the laws of nations. This declaration placed the American agent in a very unpleasant predicament, totally at a loss what further steps to take. Not able to obtain even an audience of the Empress, he soon after returned to America. Footnote: it was a singular circumstance at the court of the Empress Catherine for any foreign minister or agent to be refused an interview with Her Majesty. She had always, from pride, curiosity, or policy, condescended to converse herself with strangers who visited her court on public business. End of footnote. The failure of this negotiation might not be entirely owing to a want of diplomatic skill or experience in the agent employed at the court of Russia, though the choice of the congressional minister was perhaps not so judicious as it might have been. Many concurring circumstances prevented his success. The intrigues of Britain, the arts of France, and the profound policy of the court of Petersburg probably all combined to defeat a measure which, from the situation of some of the belligerent powers and the known character of the Empress, could not rationally have been expected at that time to meet the wishes of Congress. It was also suggested that the double dealings of some Americans of consideration had their weight in frustrating the negotiation and preventing a treaty between one of the most distinguished and influential powers in Europe and the United States of America. The above is a summary sketch of the views, the dispositions, and connections of the most important European powers, while the maneuvers in Virginia and the other southern states were ripening events which brought forward accommodations that not long after terminated in a general pacification among the nations at war. The narration of naval transactions connected with or influential on American affairs, both in the West Indies and in the European seas, is postponed to a subsequent part of this work, while we proceed to some further detail of military operations by land. End of section 36. Section 37 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 19, Part 1. General Gates surrenders the command of the Southern Army to General Greene on his arrival in South Carolina. Action between General Sumter and Colonel Tarleton. General Morgan's expedition. Meets and defeats Colonel Tarleton. Lord Cornwallis pursues General Morgan. Party of Americans cut off at the Catawba. Lord Cornwallis arrives at Hillsborough. Calls by proclamation on all the inhabitants of the state to join him. Battle of Gifford. Americans defeated. Lord Cornwallis marches toward Wilmington. General Greene pursues him. General Greene returned towards Camden. Action at Camden. Lord Rawdon evacuates Camden and returns to Charleston. Barbarous state of society among the mountaineers and in the back settlements of the Carolinas. Attack on 96. Repulse. General Greene again obliged to retreat. Execution of Colonel Hayne. Lord Rawdon leaves the state of South Carolina and embarks for England. Action at the Eutaw Springs. General Greene retires to the high hills of Santee. Governor Rutledge returns to South Carolina and resumes the reign of government. After the misfortune and suspension of General Gates, immediate steps were taken by Congress and the Commander-in-Chief to restore the reputation of the American arms, to check the progress of the British, and defeat their sanguine hopes of speedily subduing the southern colonies. Major General Greene was ordered on to take the command in that quarter. He arrived about the middle of autumn, 1780, at the headquarters of General Gates, soon after which everything seemed to wear a more favorable appearance with regard to military arrangements and operations in the American Army. General Gates surrendered the command with the dignity and firmness becoming his own character, conscious that his disappointment and defeat did not originate in any want of courage or generalship, but from the unavoidable and complicated difficulties of existing circumstances. General Greene succeeded him, received the charge of the army, and took leave of General Gates with a delicacy and propriety that evinced the high respect he felt for his predecessor. All the prudence and magnanimity, valor and humanity that adorned the character of General Greene were necessary in the choice of difficulties that attended his new command. He had succeeded a brave but unfortunate officer, whose troops were intimidated by recent defeat, dispirited by their naked and destitute situation, in a country unable to yield sufficient subsistence for one army, and which had for several months been ravaged by two. Lord Cornwallis's army was much superior in number and discipline. His troops were well clothed and regularly paid, and when General Greene first arrived, they were flushed by recent successes, particularly the defeat of General Gates. It is true, the death of Major Ferguson and the rout of his party was a serious disappointment, but not of sufficient consequence to check the designs and expectations of a British army, commanded by officers of the first military experience. The inhabitants of the country were indeed divided in opinion, bitter, rancorous, and cruel, and many of them without any fixed political principles. Fluctuating and unstable, sometimes they were the partisans of Britain and huzzaed for royalty. At others, they were the militia of the state and continental service, and professed themselves zealots for American independence. But General Greene, with remarkable coolness and intrepidity, checked their licentious conduct and punished desertion and treachery by necessary examples of severity, and thus in a short time he established a more regular discipline. Skirmishing parties pervaded all parts of the country. No one was more active and busy in those scenes than the vigilant Tarleton, and a fray took place in the month of November between him and General Sumter. After victory had several times seemed to change sides, the Continental troops won the field without much loss. General Sumter was wounded, but not dangerously. The British lost in wounded and killed near 200. The British troops had yet met with no check, which had in any degree damped their ardor, except the defeat of Major Ferguson. The most important movement, which took place for some time after this affair, was an action between General Morgan on the one part and Colonel Tarleton on the other, in the month of January, 1781. General Morgan was an early volunteer in the American warfare. He had marched from Virginia to Cambridge at the head of a body of riflemen to the aid of General Washington in 1775. He continued to stand ready to enter on the post of danger in any part of the continent where the defense of his country required the assistance of the most valorous leaders. General Greene, convinced that no man could more effectually execute any command with which he was entrusted, ordered General Morgan with a considerable force to march to the western parts of South Carolina. Lord Cornwallis, having gained intelligence of this movement, dispatched Colonel Tarleton in pursuit of General Morgan. In a few days they met near the river Pacolet. General Morgan had reason to expect from the rapid advance of Colonel Tarleton that a meeting would have taken place sooner, but by various maneuvers he kept his troops at a distance until a moment of advantage might present, for acting with decided success. The Americans had rather kept up the appearance of retreat until they reached a spot called the Cow Pens. Fortunately for them, Tarleton came up, and a resolute engagement ensued, when after a short conflict, to the great joy of the Americans, the British were routed and totally defeated. Colonel Tarleton, as one of the most resolute and active of the British partisans, was particularly selected by Lord Cornwallis and ordered to march with 1,100 men to watch the motions of Morgan, impede his designs, and keep in awe the District of 96, to which he found a detachment of the American army was moving. The unexpected defeat of Tarleton for a time threw him into the background in the opinion of many of the British officers, nor was Lord Cornwallis himself much better satisfied with his conduct. Footnote: Sir Henry Clinton observed afterwards that the unfortunate action at the Cow Pens diminished Lord Cornwallis's army nearly 1/4. If this was true, it must have been by desertion, or by a sudden defection of the inhabitants of the state who had previously aided him. End of footnote. The name of Tarleton and his successes had so long been the terror of one side and the triumph of the other, that neither had calculated on a derangement or defeat of his projects. But 300 of his men killed in the action at Cow Pens, 500 captured, and himself obliged to fly with precipitation, convinced the people that he was no longer invincible. The militia of the country were inspirited, and many of them flocked to the American standard, who had heretofore been too much intimidated to rally around it. Colonel Tarleton was severely censured by the British officers for suffering himself to be defeated, with his advantages of discipline, numbers, and everything else that in all human probability might have ensured him victory. They did not tax him with the want of personal bravery, but some of them would not allow that he had talents for anything superior to the requisites for a captain of dragoons who might skirmish and defeat in detail. However, he had certainly been considered by most of them in a higher point of view before this misfortune, but his flight and the loss of his light troops left a tarnish on his military character that could not be easily wiped off or forgiven. The loss of these light troops, so peculiarly necessary in the present service, was felt through all the succeeding campaign. But Tarleton soon recovered himself and returned from his flight. He appeared within a day or two not far from the ground from which he had been beaten, and resumed his usual boldness and barbarity. Tarleton's defeat was a blow entirely unexpected to Lord Cornwallis, and induced him to march himself from Winnsboro to the Yadkin in pursuit of General Morgan, with the hope of overtaking him and recovering the prisoners. The British troops endured this long and fatiguing march under every species of difficulty, over rivers, swamps, marshes, and creeks, with uncommon resolution and patience. What greatly enhanced their hardships and inconveniences, the path of their route was, as Lord Cornwallis expressed it, through one of the most rebellious tracts in America. General Greene, on hearing that his lordship was in pursuit of Morgan, left his post near the Padee under the command of General Huger, and with great celerity marched with a small party of friends and domestics 150 miles, and joined General Morgan before Lord Cornwallis arrived at the Catawba. In this pursuit, Lord Cornwallis cut off some of the small detachments, not in sufficient force for effectual opposition. It is true, General Davidson made an unsuccessful stand on the banks of the Catawba, with 300 or 400 men, but the British fording the river unexpectedly, he was himself killed, and his troops dispersed, and the crossing the river by the British army was no farther impeded. General Greene had ordered the Colonels Huger and Williams, whom he had left some days before at the Padee, to join him with their troops. However, it was but a very short time after this junction before General Greene had the highest reason to conclude that the safety of his troops lay only in retreat. Nor was this accomplished but with the utmost difficulty, as the way he was obliged to traverse was frequently interrupted by steep ascents and unfordable rivers. But he remarkably escaped a pursuing and powerful army, whose progress was, fortunately for the Americans, checked by the same impediments, and at much less favorable moments of arrival. Though we do not assert a miracle was wrought on the occasion, it is certain from good authority that the freshet swelled and retarded the passage of the British, while they seemed at times to suspend their rapidity in favor of the Americans, and the piety of General Greene in several of his letters attributed his remarkable escapes and the protection of his little army to the intervention of a superintending Providence. Footnote: see General Greene's own letters and the letters of other officers. End of footnote. Thus, after a flight and a chase of 15 or 20 days, supported by the most determined spirit and perseverance on both sides, General Greene reached Gifford about the middle of February, where he ordered all the troops he had left near the Padee, under officers on whom he could depend, to repair immediately to him. Lord Cornwallis, at or near the same time, took post at Hillsborough, and there erected the royal standard. General Leslie had, according to orders, left Virginia, and marched further south. He had arrived at Charleston about the middle of December. He, without delay, marched with 1,500 men, and soon overtook and joined Lord Cornwallis in the extreme part of the state. He had found the British commander immersed in chaos, perplexity, and fatigue, endeavoring with all his ability to restore by force the authority of his master. Among the people, the majority of whom he soon found to his mortification were totally averse to the government and authority of Great Britain. General Leslie continued with him until some time after the Battle of Gifford, and by his bravery and activity was essentially serviceable to the royal cause. At Hillsborough, Lord Cornwallis by proclamation called upon all the faithful votaries to the crown of Britain to repair immediately to his camp with 10 days' provisions, to assist in the full restoration of constitutional government. Members from all parts of the country listened anew to the invitations and threatenings of the British commander, and moved with all possible dispatch towards his camp. But many of them fell on their way by the fatal mistake of misapprehending the characters and connections of the partisans about them. It must be extremely difficult in a country rent and sundered by civil feuds and in arms under different leaders of parties opposed to each other, to know at once, in the hurry and confusion of crossing and recrossing, to join their friends, whether they were not encircled by their enemies. End of section 37. Section 38 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 19, Part 2. Tarleton himself had sometimes mistaken his own partisans for the friends of Congress. Thus many of the Royalists, as they were hastening to take protection under the banners of their king, were cut down by the same hand that spread slaughter and desolation among the opposers of the monarch. Many unfortunate victims of the sword drew destruction upon themselves by similar mistakes. An instance of this, among others shocking to the feelings of humanity, was the massacre of 300 or 400 of this description of persons, headed by Colonel Piles. They accidentally fell in the way of a Continental detachment, commanded by General Pickens, the Royalists mistaking the Republicans for Tarleton and his party, whom Pickens was pursuing. They acknowledged themselves the subjects of the crown, made a merit of their advance, and called on Colonel Tarleton as their leader. Nor were they undeceived, but by the blow that deprived them of life. It is indeed to be much lamented that they were treated with as little mercy, and all cut down with equal cruelty, to any that had been experienced by the Americans from the most remorseless of their foes. While in the state of confusion and depredation through the whole country, General Greene and Lord Cornwallis lay at no great distance from each other, but Greene kept his position as much as possible concealed, as he was not yet in a situation to venture decisive action, and though he was obliged to move earlier towards the British encampment, no engagement took place until about the middle of March. In the meantime, by his ability and address, he eluded the vigilance of his enemies, and kept himself secure by a continual change of posts, until strengthened by fresh reinforcements of the North Carolina and Virginia militia. The few Continental troops he had with him, joined by these, and a number of volunteers from the interior mountainous tracts of the western wilderness, induced him to think he might risk a general action. On the 15th of March, the two armies met at Guilford, and seemed at first to engage with equal ardor, but as usual, the raw militia were intimidated by the valor and discipline of British veterans. Almost the whole corps of Carolinians threw down their arms and fled, many of them without even once discharging their firelocks. This, of course, deranged the American army, yet they supported the action with great spirit and bravery for an hour and a half, when they were entirely broken and obliged to retreat with the utmost precipitation. Both armies suffered much by the loss of many gallant officers and a considerable number of men. Lord Cornwallis kept the field and claimed a complete victory, but the subsequent transactions discovered that the balance of real advantage lay on the other side. His lordship, immediately after the action at Gifford, proclaimed pardon and protection to all the inhabitants of the country on proper submission, yet at the same time he found it necessary to quit his present ground. He had previously taken the determination to try the success of the British arms in North Carolina and Virginia. He formed this resolution early and would have prosecuted it immediately after Ferguson's defeat in October 1780 had he not been detained by sickness. After his recovery he pursued the design, and for this purpose had ordered General Leslie to leave Virginia, who, as has been observed, joined him with a large detachment of troops about midwinter. His lordship, however, thought proper still to postpone his original design with the hope of bringing General Greene to a decided action, and thereby more firmly uniting the inhabitants of the country to the royal cause. After the action at Gifford and the dispersion of the American troops, Lord Cornwallis found it difficult to procure forage and provisions sufficient for the subsistence of his army. He left the late field of action and moved onwards a few miles, and halted at Bell's Mills, where he stayed 2 days and gave the troops a small supply of provisions. From thence he moved slowly on account of his sick and wounded to Cross Creek. It appears by his own letter to Lord George Germain that he had intended to continue thereabouts for some short time, but a variety of disappointments that occurred induced him to alter his resolution. In this letter he observes, "From all my information, I intended to have halted at Cross Creek as a proper place to refresh and refit the troops, and I was much disappointed on my arrival there to find it totally impossible. Provisions were scarce, not 4 days' forage within 20 miles, and to us the navigation of the Cape Fear River to Wilmington impracticable, but the distance by water is upwards of 100 miles. Under these circumstances, I was obliged to continue my march to this place." Footnote: see Earl Cornwallis's letter to Lord George Germain, dated Wilmington, April 18th, 1781. End of footnote. Lord Cornwallis, having decamped from the neighborhood of his late military operations, marched with all possible expedition toward the more eastern parts of North Carolina. He found many difficulties on his way, but pursued his route with great perseverance, as did his army. They cheerfully sustained the severest fatigue, but as they had frequently done before, they marked their way with the slaughter of the active and the blood of the innocent inhabitants through a territory of many hundred miles, in extent from Charleston to Yorktown. It was afterwards computed that 1,400 widows were made during this year's campaign, only in the single district of 96. Footnote: General Greene's letters authenticate this fact. End of footnote. After the defeat at Gifford, General Greene availed himself of his religious opinions to obtain relief and assistance from the neighboring country. He had been educated in the Quaker denomination of Christians, but not too scrupulously attached to their tenets to take arms in defense of American liberty. The inhabitants in the vicinity of both armies generally belonged to that sect. In the distress of the retreating army, he called them out to the exercise of that benevolence and charity of which they make the highest professions. He wrote and reminded them that though they could not conscientiously, consistently with the principles they professed, gird on the sword for the usual operations of war, yet nothing could excuse them from the exercise of compassion and assistance to the sick and wounded. To this they were exhorted by their principles, and an ample field was now displayed to evince their sincerity by every charitable act. His letters were more influential on this mild and unoffending body of people than the proclamations of Lord Cornwallis. They united to take care of the sick, to dress the wounded, and make collections of provisions for the relief of the flying army. This was a very essential advantage to General Greene, whose confidence in the simplicity and kindness of this body of people relieved him from any anxiety and embarrassment relative to the sick and wounded he was obliged to leave behind. Their example probably had an influence on others of different denominations, and indeed on most of the people in the circumjacent villages, whom we shall soon see quitting the royal standard and following the fortune of the routed commander and his army, notwithstanding the high hopes which had been entertained for a short time by the British that this defeat would put an end to any other effective operations of the rebel General Greene, as they styled him in their letters. In consequence of the action at Gifford, General Greene had to lament the loss of several valuable officers, among whom were the Generals Stevens and Huger, dangerously wounded, but those who were faithful to the service on principles of supporting the general liberties of their country lost no part of their vigor or fortitude under the sharpest disappointments and misfortunes, but rallied anew and set their hardy faces against the most adverse circumstances that might arise in the dangerous and uncertain conflict. This General Greene attested in all his letters, yet the ignorance of the people in general, the little knowledge they had of the principles of the contest, the want of stable principles of any kind among the generality of the inhabitants, rendered dependence on their fidelity very uncertain, on both sides the question, and put it beyond the calculation on events, as neither the British or American commanders could make an accurate statement of numbers from day to day that belonged to their own army. Self-preservation often led both parties to deception, and the danger of the moment sometimes, more than the turpitude of the heart, prompted them to act under disguise. The letters and accounts of all the general officers on both sides of the question portray these difficulties in a style and manner more descriptive than can be done by anyone who did not feel the complicated miseries which involved both armies and the inhabitants of the Carolinas at this period. To them the reader is referred, while we yet followed the American commander through perplexity, embarrassment, and fatigue, too complex for description. After the defeat at Gifford, General Greene was far from being discouraged or intimidated by the victorious triumph of his enemies. He retreated with a steady step and retired only 10 or 15 miles from the scene of the late action. He had every reason to expect a second rencounter with the British army, who boasted that their victory was complete, though it was acknowledged by Lord Cornwallis that the action at Gifford was the bloodiest that had yet taken place during the war. Footnote: see Lord Cornwallis's letter to Sir Henry Clinton and Clinton's narrative, page 9. End of footnote. Yet when Lord Cornwallis withdrew from the late scene of action, it did not appear so much the result of a systematic design of an able general as it did that of the retreat of a conquered army. This, with other circumstances, induced General Greene, after he had collected most of his scattered troops, to follow his lordship rather than to fly further. The inhabitants of the country, singular as it may appear, from this time more generally flocked to the camp of the defeated than to that of the conquering general. A more thorough disaffection to British government hourly appeared, and a more impressive alarm from the apprehensions of subjugation seemed to discover itself from the day of the retreat at Gifford. Numbers from all quarters came forward, and General Greene soon found himself in a situation to pursue in his turn. He accordingly followed the British army through the crossroads and difficult paths for about 10 days, when finding his lordship declined meeting him again, and that by the rapidity of his movements their distance widened. General Greene thought it best to halt and not further attempt to impede the route of the British commander toward Wilmington, and prepared himself to prosecute his previous design of relieving the state of South Carolina without farther delay. End of section 38. Section 39 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 19, Part 3. Within a few days he began his march toward Camden, the headquarters of Lord Rawdon, on whom the command had devolved, and who was there encamped with only 900 men. General Greene's approach was rather unexpected to Rawdon, but by a sudden and judicious advance, he fell on the Americans before they were in readiness for his reception. Notwithstanding this sudden attack, which took place on the 25th of April, General Greene, always cool and collected, sustained a severe conflict with his usual intrepidity, but was again obliged to retreat, though his numbers were superior. Yet he observed about this time that he was not so amply supported as he might have expected by aides from Virginia, Maryland, or elsewhere, and that in North Carolina, such was the fluctuation of opinion, the operation of fear, and a too general want of principle, that he could not place the strongest confidence in many who accompanied him. Lord Rawdon attempted soon after to bring General Greene to a second engagement, but he too well understood the advantages he might gain by declining it. The consequences justified his conduct, as Lord Rawdon, in a few days after the action at Camden, burnt many of the mills, adjacent private houses, and other buildings, and evacuated the post to move toward Charleston, where he judged his presence was more immediately necessary. This sudden evacuation of Camden inspirited the Continentals, and inspired them with a dangerous enthusiasm that for a time could not be resisted. The banks of the rivers and the country were scoured by various partisans in pursuit of forage and provisions, which were generally secured by the Americans, after skirmishing and fighting their way through small parties of the enemy, too weak for successful opposition. Sumter, Marion, and other leaders General Greene observed had people who adhered to them and appeared closely attached, yet perhaps more from a desire and the opportunity of plundering than from an inclination to promote the independence of the United States. General Greene was attended and supported by many brave, humane, and valiant officers in his peregrinations through the Carolinas, but their followers were too generally licentious beyond description. This sometimes impelled him to severities that wounded the feelings of the man, though necessary in the discipline of an army. A detail of all the smaller encounters that took place in this hostile period, in both the Carolinas, might fatigue more than it would gratify the humane or inquisitive mind. It is enough to observe that the Americans, under various leaders and some capital commanders, were continually attacking, with alternate success and defeat, the chain of British posts planted from Camden to 96, and as General Greene himself expressed his sentiments in their embarrassed situation, "We fight, get beaten, rise, and fight again. The whole country is one continued scene of slaughter and blood. This country may struggle a little longer, but unless they have more effectual support, they must fall." Footnote: General Greene's letter to the Chevalier de la Luzerne. End of footnote. It is to be lamented that very many in this day of general distress suffered themselves to be governed either by vindictive passions or their feelings of resentment for personal injuries. Many took advantage of the public confusion to gratify, if not to justify, their own private revenge, a stronger stimulus with some than any public or political principle. Besides these, there were numbers who seemed to enlist under the banners of liberty, with no views but those of rapine, assassination, and robbery, and after they had for a time rioted in the indulgence of those infernal passions, they frequently deserted and repaired to the British camp, and renewed each scene of villainy against the party they had just left. They were indeed well calculated to become instruments in the hands of the British officers, to perpetrate the cruelties they were too much disposed to inflict on the steady adherents to the American cause. Thus, whether they pretended to be the partisans of the one side or the other, rapacity and violence raged among a fierce people, little accustomed to the restraints of law and subordination. The manners of the mountaineers and borderers of the Carolinas exemplify too strongly the native ferocity of man. Though descended from civilized ancestors, it cannot be denied that when for a length of time a people have been used to the modes of savage life common to the rude stages of society, not feeling themselves restrained by penal laws, nor under the influence of reason or religion, nor yet impressed by apprehensions of disgrace, they sink into the habits of savages, and appear scarce a grade above the brutal race. Thus it required a very severe military discipline to reduce to order the rude peasantry that poured down from the mountains and collected from the most rough, uncultivated parts of the country. Dissension, mutiny, robbery, and murder spread to an alarming degree. There were too many instances of villainy and barbarity to render it necessary to adduce more than a single fact that may convey an idea of the hazard of life without the risk of battle. We mention therefore only the death of a Colonel Grierson, a distinguished loyalist, because this circumstance is particularly noticed by the commanders of both armies. This gentleman was shot by an unknown hand after he had surrendered his arms to the Americans. Great exertion was made to discover the perpetrator of this cruel deed. General Greene offered a reward of 100 guineas for the detection of the murderer, but without effect. Private assassination had become too familiar a crime in that hostile country for the perpetrators to betray each other. Perhaps few officers could have extricated themselves and recovered from the unforeseen embarrassments that attended him through the Southern campaign with the facility, judgment, and perseverance that marked the conduct of the American commander in the Carolinas. His mind was replete with resources in the greatest difficulties, and his resolution equal to the severest enterprise, while the humanity of his disposition led him to soften as much as possible the horrors of war. The placidity of his manners engaged the affections of his friends, and the esteem and respect of his enemies. Yet he was obliged to make some severe examples of atrocious characters, and to punish by death several who were detected under the description of deserters and assassins. After the action at Camden, Marion, Pickens, and Lee, with their partisans, attacked and carried a number of small forts in the district of 96, with little or no effectual opposition until they crossed the Santee and attacked Fort Cornwallis, commanded by Colonel Brown, who defended it with great spirit and gallantry. As the Americans approached, the British garrison, for their own better security, nearly covered themselves underground. They obstinately refused to surrender, until every man who attempted to fire upon the besiegers was instantly shot down. But after a siege of 12 or 14 days, the fort, with about 300 men, was surrendered by capitulation. Brown had been so barbarous and ferocious a partisan that he was hourly apprehensive of meeting with summary vengeance from the hands of some of those who had suffered, either in their persons or their friends. Many he had murdered in cold blood, others he had cruelly delivered into the hands of the savages to suffer longer torture. But the victor, feeling compassion for individual suffering, sent him under an escort for his better security to Savannah. Without this indulgence, he must have fallen an immediate sacrifice, as he had to pass through a long tract of country, where he had been active in perpetrating the severest cruelties, accompanied by a number of loyalists, between whom and the adherents to the American cause there raged such an infernal spirit of bitterness that extermination seemed to be equally the wish of both parties. The leaders of the American partisans were frequently checked by the humane advice of General Greene. He exhorted them that it was more their duty by their lenity to induce those in opposition to unite with them in supporting the cause of freedom than it was to aim at their extermination. In a letter to Pickens he observed that the principles of humanity as well as policy required that proper measures should be immediately taken to restrain abuses, heal differences, and unite the people as much as possible. While these desultory excursions were kept up, General Greene was endeavoring to concentrate his forces for the prosecution of more important objects. Many occurrences had redounded, much to his honor, though some of them were unfortunate. But his misfortunes did not impair his military reputation, nor was his courage or ability called in question on his assault on 96, though it did not terminate agreeably to his hopes. The garrison was defended with the greatest spirit and ability by Lieutenant Colonel Kruger. They sustained a siege with almost unexampled bravery from the 24th of May to the 18th of June. Notwithstanding the valor of the British troops and the fortitude of their commander, they were reduced to the point of surrender, when by the address of an American lady, prompted by a laudable affection for her husband, a British officer within the garrison, she found means to convey a letter to Colonel Kruger, with the pleasing intelligence that if they could hold out a short time longer, their deliverance might be certain, that reinforcements were at hand, that Lord Rawdon was marching to their relief with 2,000 fresh troops who had arrived within 7 days from Ireland. It was happy for General Greene that he obtained early information that this strong body was on their way, and was hourly expected by his antagonists, but it was very affecting to the feelings of honor, patriotism, or pride to find himself obliged to raise the siege, almost in the moment of victory, and to retreat with precipitation from a spot where, but a day before, he had reason to flatter himself he should reap the laurels of conquest. This unexpected turn of affairs was truly distressing to the American commander. It was painful and humiliating to be compelled again to fly before a pursuing enemy, to the extreme parts of a country he had recently trodden over with so much fatigue and peril. Some of his associates were so much disheartened by the untoward circumstances of the campaign that they advised him to fly from Carolina and to endeavor to save himself and the remainder of his troops by retreating to Virginia. To this advice General Greene replied in the laconic style of the Spartan, with the spirit of a Roman and the enthusiasm of an American. "I will recover this country, or perish in the attempt." His subsequent conduct and success justified his noble resolution. He soon collected the militia from the distant parts of the state, called in his detachments, and inspirited his troops so far as to recover his usual confidence in them. This encouraged him to offer battle to Lord Rawdon on the 12th of July. His lordship, strongly posted at Orangeburg and strengthened by additional troops from several quarters, declined the challenge. This was not because he did not think himself in sufficient force to accept it. He had previously determined to return to Charleston as soon as circumstances would permit. His presence was there necessary, not only on account of military arrangements, but from the confusion and disorder of civil affairs, the animosities of the citizens of different descriptions, the insolence of the loyalists, and the complaints of those who had been compelled to a temporary submission. End of section 39. His presence there was necessary. His presence was there necessary. Section 40 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 19, Part 4. When Lord Rawdon withdrew from Orangeburg, he left a sufficient number of troops for its defense, and making due arrangements for the security of other posts, he hastened to Charleston. On this, General Greene detached a part of his own army to march towards the capital, and returned himself with the remainder, and took post on the heights near the Santee. From thence he continually harassed the British by small parties, who alternately returned these aggressions. Skirmish and defeat, plunder, slaughter, and devastation were everywhere displayed, from the extremity of the country to the environs of the city. Several weeks elapsed before the operations of either army were more concentrated. While the military operations against the Americans were vigorously pursued without, the devoted city of Charleston suffered misery beyond description within. Severity, cruelty, and despair raged for a time without check or control. A single instance of inhumanity in the sacrifice of one of the victims of their resentment will be sufficient to evince the rigor and impolicy of British measures. The execution of Colonel Hayne will leave a stain on the character of Lord Rawdon without exhibiting any other proofs of barbarous severity. This gentleman had been a distinguished and very active officer in the American service, previous to the subjugation of Charleston. When this event took place, he found himself called to a separation from his family, a dereliction of his property, and submission to the conqueror. In this situation, he thought it his duty to become a voluntary prisoner and take his parole. On surrendering himself, he offered to engage and stand bound on the principles of honor, to do nothing prejudicial to the British interest until he was exchanged. But his abilities and his services were of such consideration to his country that he was refused a parole, and told he must become a British subject or submit to close confinement. His family was then in a distant part of the country and in great distress by sickness and from the ravages of the Loyalists in their neighborhood. Thus he seemed impelled to acknowledge himself the subject of a government he had relinquished from the purest principles, or renounce his tenderest connections and leave them without a possibility of his assistance, and at a moment when he hourly expected to hear of the death of an affectionate wife, ill of the smallpox. In this state of anxiety, he subscribed a declaration of his allegiance to the King of Great Britain, with this express exception, that he should never be required to take arms against his country. Notwithstanding this, he was soon and repeatedly called upon to arm in support of a government he detested, or to submit to the severest punishment. Brigadier General Patterson, Commandant of the garrison, and the Intendant of the British Police, a Mr. Simpson, had both assured Colonel Hayne that no such thing would be required, and added that when the Royal Army could not defend a country without the aid of its inhabitants, it would be time to quit it. Footnote: see a representation of Colonel Hayne's case, laid before Congress after his death. End of footnote. Colonel Hayne considered a requisition to act in British service, after assurances that this would never be required, as a breach of contract and a release in the eye of conscience from any obligation on his part. Accordingly, he took the first opportunity of resuming his arms as an American, assumed the command of his own regiment, and all fond of their former commander, Colonel Hayne marched with the defensible body to the relief of his countrymen, then endeavoring to drive the British partisans and keep them within the environs of Charleston. He very unfortunately in a short time fell into the hands of a strong British party, sent out for the recovery of a favorite officer, who had left the American cause and become a devotee to British government. Footnote: this was a General Williamson, captured within 7 miles of the city by a small reconnoitering party sent out by Colonel Hayne. End of footnote. As soon as Colonel Hayne was captured, he was closely imprisoned. This was on the 26th of July. He was notified the same day that a court of officers would assemble the next day to determine in what point of view he ought to be considered. On the 29th, he was informed that in consequence of a court of inquiry held the day before, Lord Rawdon and Lieutenant Colonel Balfour had resolved upon his execution within 2 days. His astonishment at these summary and illegal proceedings can scarcely be conceived. He wrote Lord Rawdon that he had no intimation of anything more than a court of inquiry to determine whether he should be considered as an American or a British subject. If the first, he ought to be set at liberty on parole. If the last, he claimed a legal trial. He assured his lordship that on a trial he had many things to urge in his defense, reasons that would be weighty in a court of equity, and concluded his letter with observing, "If, sir, I am refused this favor which I cannot conceive from your justice or humanity, I earnestly entreat that my execution may be deferred, that I may, at least, take a last farewell of my children and prepare for the solemn change." Footnote. See a more full account of the treatment of Colonel Hayne in his own papers, afterwards presented to Congress. End of footnote. But his death predetermined, his enemies were deaf to the voice of compassion. The execution of his sentence was hastened, though the reputation and merits of this gentleman were such that the whole city was zealous for his preservation. Not only the inhabitants in opposition to British government, but even Lieutenant Governor Bull, at the head of the Royalists, interceded for his life. The principal ladies of Charleston endeavored by their compassionate interference to arrest or influence the relentless hand of power. They drew up and presented to Lord Rawdon a delicate and pathetic petition in his behalf. His near relations and his children, who had just performed the funeral rites over the grave of a tender mother, appeared on their bended knees to implore the life of their father. But in spite of the supplications of children and friends, strangers and foes, the flinty heart of Lord Rawdon remained untouched amidst these scenes of sensibility and distress. No amelioration of the sentence could be obtained, and this affectionate father took a final leave of his children in a manner that pierced the souls of the beholders. To the eldest of them, a youth about 13 years of age, he delivered a transcript of his case, directed him to convey it to Congress, and ordered him to see that his father's remains were deposited in the tomb of his ancestors. Pinioned like a criminal, this worthy citizen walked with composure through crowds of admiring spectators, with the dignity of the philosopher and the intrepidity of the Christian. He suffered as a hero, and was hanged as a felon, amidst the tears of the multitude and the curses of thousands who execrated the perpetrators of this cruel deed. Soon after this transaction, Lord Rawdon, on account of the broken state of his health, obtained leave to repair to England. Captured on his passage by the Count de Grave, he was detained a short time, but soon after his arrival on the shores of Great Britain, his singular treatment of Colonel Hayne was the topic of every conversation, and was proved to have been so pointedly severe as to be thought worthy of parliamentary discussion. The strictures of the Duke of Richmond thereon were pointed with severity. He thought the dignity and humanity of the nation called loudly for a court of inquiry on high-handed executions, without trial or any opportunity given for legal defense. This motion, however, was productive of no consequences, except the ebullitions of Lord Rawdon's resentment, who, it was observed, conducted more with the violence of a soldier of untutored manners than with the urbanity or the politeness of the gentleman. He wrote to the noble Duke in high and offensive language, little if anything short of a direct challenge, but his Grace did not deign to think himself accountable to an individual for defending the principles of equity and the cause of the injured in the freedom of parliamentary debate and investigation. After Lord Rawdon had taken leave of America and embarked for England, the command of the British Army in Charleston devolved on Colonel Balfour. This officer, though a brave man, was not distinguished for his humanity, nor did he seem more disposed on a new acquisition of power to soften the rigors of war than his predecessors in command. It had, previous to the present period, appeared by the letters of Colonel Balfour that his apprehensions relative to the Southern campaign and the termination of the war had been clouded to a considerable degree. He had written to Sir Henry Clinton on the 6th of May that their situation was exceedingly distressing and dreadful, notwithstanding Lord Rawdon's brilliant successes, that the enemy's parties were everywhere, that the communication with Savannah by land was everywhere cut off, that the Colonels Brown, Kruger, and others, at different important posts, were in the most critical situation. He added in the same letter, "Indeed, I should betray the duty I owe your Excellency, did I not represent the defection of this province so universal, that I know of no mode, short of depopulation, to retain it. The spirit of revolt is kept up by the many officers, prisoners of war. I should therefore think it advisable to remove them, as well as to make some striking examples of such as had taken protections, yet snatch every occasion to rise in arms against us." Whether Colonel Balfour wished to be the executioner of this cruel policy or not, he justified it in his answer to General Greene, who demanded the reason of Hayne's execution. Balfour replied that it took place by the joint orders of Lord Rawdon and himself, in consequence of Lord Cornwallis's directions to put every man to death who might be found in arms, if he had been received as a subject to Great Britain after the capitulation of Charleston in 1780. General Greene threatened retaliation, but his humanity led him to the suspension of such severities, though he felt wounded at the treatment of a person of such real merit as Colonel Hayne, and the premature stroke that robbed his country and his family of this brave, unfortunate man. He pointedly criminated the authors of his death as acting an unjust, inhuman, and an illegal part. In a letter to Colonel Balfour, he observed that he was happy for the honor of Colonel Hayne, that nothing could be found against him to warrant his execution, but the order of Lord Cornwallis, given in the hour of victory, when he considered the lives, liberties, and property of the people prostrate at his feet. But I confess I cannot repress my astonishment that you and Lord Rawdon should give such an extraordinary example of severity upon the authority of that order, under such a change of circumstances, so long after it had been remonstrated against by myself in a letter to Lord Cornwallis. I informed his lordship that his orders were cruel and unprecedented, and that he might expect retaliation from the friends of the unfortunate. Footnote: General Greene's letters to Lord Cornwallis and Colonel Balfour in his dispatches to Congress at this time. End of footnote. Indeed, it was the universal voice that the conduct of Rawdon and Balfour in this affair could be justified by no law, civil or military, and was totally repugnant to the spirit of humanity or to divine injunctions. General Greene declared in the most solemn manner that he had never authorized or countenanced executions on such principles, that he had done all in his power to soften resentment, to conciliate the inhabitants of different descriptions, and to prevent as much as possible all private assassinations, which had too frequently taken place, in spite of discipline or humanity, and that he sanctioned no public executions, but for the crimes of desertion and murder, crimes which by no construction could be charged on Colonel Hayne. End of section 40. Section 41 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 19, Conclusion. But the death of this worthy man, the victim of resentment, was not avenged by retaliation as threatened. It was postponed from the humanity and generosity of the American commander, as well as from the uncertainty of all human events, and the impossibility of calculating from the chances of war which party might be the greatest sufferers, by a determined spirit of retaliation and execution on both sides. Fierce encounters were still kept up between the British detachments posted on advantageous heights and on the banks of deep and unfordable rivers, which intersected each other, and the hardy chieftains who led the Carolinian bands over mountains, declivities, swamps, and rivers to the vicinity of the city. Thence they were often obliged to retreat back from the borders of civilization and softer habitations, again to seek safety in the dreary wilderness, to which they were pursued by their enemies, who were sometimes repelled at others successful in cutting off the little parties of Americans, until the British, wearied by the mutual interchange of hostilities without decision, drew in their cantonments and took post about the beginning of September at the Utah Springs, which were situated at the distance of only 50 miles from Charleston. General Greene had, when near the waters of the Congaree, while they were separated at the distance of only 15 miles, attempted to bring them to a closer engagement, but there appeared at that time no inclination in the British to meet him. He found they were about to take a new position. This induced him to follow them by a circuitous march of 70 or 80 miles. Desultory skirmishes continued during the month of August, but on the 8th of September, General Greene again renewed his challenge, fought and obtained an advantage that was an overbalance of the many successless encounters that had long kept the public mind in suspense and apprehension, and Greene's army in such a continual fluctuation that there was no calculating its numbers or its strength. From day to day, General Greene advanced to the Springs, where the main body of the British troops were collected. He had with him only about 2,000 men, but these were commanded by some of the best of his officers. They attacked and routed the British encampment. The action was severe. Great numbers of the British officers and soldiers were either slain or captured. Yet the Americans suffered so much that Colonel Stewart, the British commander, claimed the advantage. Indeed, General Greene suffered the loss of many brave soldiers and some very valuable officers. A Colonel Campbell of Virginia fell to the termination of the action, and had time after the mortal wound only to observe that, as the British fled, he died contented. Colonel Stewart wrote Sir Henry Clinton a detail of the affair, in the pompous style of victory, but notwithstanding he arrogated so much on the occasion, the action at the Utah Springs put a period to all farther offensive operations in that quarter, and the British troops after this seldom ventured far beyond the boundaries of Charleston. Besides the number slain in this action, 400 or 500 of the British troops were made prisoners of war. The Americans suffered equally, and perhaps in greater proportion to their numbers than the British. Not less than 500 men and upwards of 60 officers were killed or captured, besides the wounded. After this action, General Greene retired again for a time to the heights bordering on the River Santee. A new face to affairs now soon appeared in the city. The Royal Army had been so much reduced by the vigilance and activity of General Greene that what has been denominated by some writers a reaction of events began to operate. The British adherence to monarchy in Charleston and the power and influence of royal government were in a short time brought very low. Consequently, the sufferings of those who had triumphed in the depression and subjugation of their own countrymen were felt with almost equal rigor and severity to that which had been inflicted on the opposers of British authority when their commanders, in all the insolence of conquest, contemplated the certainty of the subjugation of the southern states. Governor Rutledge had left the state of South Carolina and repaired to Philadelphia after the surrender of Charleston. He now returned and reassumed the reins of government. Soon after his arrival in his native state, the governor published a proclamation offering pardon on certain conditions to all who had been aiding in British service, except such as had signed addresses and voluntarily taken commissions to support the arms and authority of Great Britain. The injunctions contained in this proclamation, dated the 27th of September, were rigorously executed. All those who were implicated as opposed either in principle or practice to the interests or to the arms of their own country felt heavily the reverse of a change of masters. The governor, feeling not only the miseries in which his native state had been so long involved, but the highest indignation at the treatment received by individuals and the inflictions imposed on many by the severity of Rawdon and Balfour, suffered his resentment to fall indiscriminately on all the partisans of royalty. Many who had reaped the sweets of changing with the times by availing themselves of the property of those who had fled were now compelled by the governor to fly from their agreeable plantations. This description of people had seized the villas of those who had taken their standard under congressional protection, rather than relinquish their independence by becoming subjects of the King of England. They had occupied without the city the best accommodated situations which had before belonged to the captured or exiled inhabitants who had opposed the British invasion. This class of persons were now reduced to the necessity of removing into a town still occupied by foreign troops, driven into the city, and shut up with their families at inconvenient huts, the reverse of the easy accommodations to which they had lately been used, and the affluence which some of them had formerly possessed. Many of them fell a prey to sickness and the concomitant miseries of war. Nor less aggravated were the distresses of those inhabitants within the city, whose fidelity to their country could not be shaken, and whose connections were in arms without. They suffered every kind of distress, yet with the most heroic firmness, and even the ladies in many instances gave a glorious example of female fortitude. They submitted patiently to inconveniences never before felt, to hardships they had never expected, and wept in secret the miseries of their country and their separation from their tenderest connections, with whom they were forbidden all intercourse, and were not permitted the soft alleviation of the exchange of letters. With becoming dignity, they had secluded themselves from the gaieties of the city, and refused on all occasions to partake of any amusements in company with British officers, while with a charitable hand they visited and soothed, whenever possible, the miserable victims crowded on board prison ships and thrust into jails. Their conduct was resented by the officers of the army, who themselves affronted them and exposed them to insults of every kind, instead of defending the tender and helpless sex, as is justly expected and required by the laws of civilization and humanity. But the busy hand of time was ripening events, had put a period to their afflictions, at least for such of them as lived through the perils and hardships of the siege. The capture of their city, the waste of their property, the exile from their families, and sufferings too many to recount, which are usually inflicted on the vanquished by the conqueror. Among those who lived to return from their banishment to St. Augustine was the venerable Gadsden, who, through all the shocks of fortune and the rotation of events which he experienced, was never shaken in his principles. He had always deserved and retained the confidence of his country, a firm, uniform Republican. He was chosen a member of the General Congress which met in New York in 1765. He was a worthy delegate in the respected assembly which assumed and declared the independence of the United States in 1776. He had no predilection in favor of kings, and was ever averse to monarchic institutions and usages. This was probably a reason why he suffered such particular severities from the British commander. Notwithstanding his long confinement at the castle of St. Augustine and his own personal sufferings, he lived to exemplify his humanity and generosity toward persons who had been accessory, if not principals, in instigating the British officers to cruelties towards him, which they would not otherwise have practiced. The General Assembly of the state was called upon to meet at Jacksonboro, the beginning of the ensuing year. Their constitution required a rotation of office, which rendered Mr. Rutledge ineligible to serve longer as their first magistrate. In consequence of this, Mr. Gadsden was chosen governor, but his advanced age and declining health induced him to refuse the laborious task. This was a period of peculiar difficulty in the administration of the civil affairs of the state. In the sessions at Jacksonboro, there was little lenity exercised toward that description of persons who had taken British protections or had in any manner abetted their measures, either in the city or the field. Their property was confiscated, many of their persons condemned to banishment, and the most rigorous prosecutions commenced against all suspected persons. Though Mr. Gadsden had declined acting as governor of the state, he did not sit down an inactive spectator of the infringements of humanity or justice in society, into which persons might be hurried by an overheated zeal, or the want of a proper restraint on the prejudices and passions of men. He vigorously opposed the proceedings of the Assembly, which cut off the Loyalists from returning to their allegiance, even if they had wished it, and sitting down quietly in the bosom of their country. It is now time to leave for the present the deranged state of their civil police, and the hostile confusion which still pervaded the two most southern colonies, South Carolina and Georgia, and pursue the narrative of the march of the British Army through North Carolina. The slaughter that accompanied this route, through every stage of its progress, is an unpleasant tale. There appeared few interludes of humane and generous deportment toward the miserable, from the borders of South Carolina until Lord Cornwallis reached the important stand in Virginia, which finished his career of military fame and success, and again humbled the proud glory of the British arms beneath the standard of the Americans. But before we follow the conqueror of Charleston in his pursuit of new victories in the more central part of the Union, we will just observe that no one of the 13 United States felt more severely the fatal consequences of revolutionary convulsions than that of South Carolina. Many of the best of its citizens perished in the conflict. Others, from independence and opulence, were reduced to the lowest grade of hopeless penury, while they beheld with astonishment the sudden accumulation of fortune by those whom they had viewed as a subordinate class, now grown up to incalculable wealth, amidst confusion and depredation. The convenient situations for commerce which they had formerly occupied were soon after possessed by British agents sent on at the close of the war to reap the gleanings of property by the demands of a speedy liquidation of old British debts. Those debts could not be discharged by men whose plantations were ruined, their slaves enticed or stolen away, and every other species of property wasted in the general pillage. Their capital had been held for a considerable time as a conquered city by the invaders of life, liberty, and property, sanctioned by the authority of the King of England. It is obvious that his patronage and protection should forever have nurtured the peace, prosperity, and growth of the American colonies. Both interest and policy dictated the wisdom of this line of conduct, which would have prevented the irretrievable blow which rent in sunder the Empire of Britain. But as a wounded limb, pruned or bent downwards, yet not destroyed by the hand of the rude invader, sometimes revives and flourishes with new vigor, while the parent stock is weakened and its decay accelerated by the exuberance of its former luxury and strength. So may some future period behold the united colonies, notwithstanding their depression and their energetic struggles for freedom, revivified and raised to a degree of political consideration that may convince the parent state of the importance of their loss. They may perhaps be taught to dread any future rupture with a people grown strong by oppression and become respectable among all nations, for their manly resistance to the tyrannous hand stretched out to enslave them. End of section 41. Section 42 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 20, Part 1. Lord Cornwallis marches to Wilmington. Marquis de la Lafayette sent to Virginia. Death of General Phillips. Lord Cornwallis moves from Petersburg to Williamsburg. Dissonant opinions between him and Sir Henry Clinton. Crosses James River. Takes post at Portsmouth. Indecision of Sir Henry Clinton. Meditates an attack on Philadelphia. The project relinquished. In the first moments of victory, the mind is generally elate with the expectation of applause and the prospect of additional fame. This was exemplified in the conduct of Lord Cornwallis, when the retreating Americans had turned their faces from the field of Gifford and left him to publish proclamations, invitations, and pardon to the inhabitants of the South. The scepter of mercy was held out to them, on condition that they were sufficiently humbled to become the obedient subjects of those who had destroyed their liberty, their property, the lives of their friends, to obtain inglorious conquest and arbitrary dominion. He was a man of understanding and sagacity, though not so thoroughly acquainted with the natural feelings of mankind as to escape a disappointment from the conduct of the Carolinians. They revolted at the idea of seeing one American state after another, subdued and laid low at the feet of foreign conquerors. Many, whose minds had been held in a neutral state previous to this period, now repaired with great precipitation to the congressional officers and enlisted under their banners for the defense of their native country. Lord Cornwallis, after the action at Gifford and the retreat of General Greene, lost no time in expediting his previous plans and military arrangements, and, consistently with his own character, he soon moved to endeavor to prosecute them with success. He had reason to calculate that when he had finished a long and fatiguing march which lay before him, that he should meet General Phillips in Virginia with a large body of troops, and by their junction impede all resistance and re-establish the authority of their master in that rebellious state. Instead of a completion of these expectations, he had, when he arrived there, only to witness a fresh instance of the uncertainty of human hope, followed by a train of new disappointments. The British commander immediately hastened by the most convenient route to Wilmington, and from thence to Petersburg. Innumerable difficulties had attended Lord Cornwallis and his army in his march from Gifford to Wilmington, but in his judgment the march was absolutely necessary. Such was the situation and the distress of the troops, and so great were the sufferings of the sick and wounded, that he had no option left after they had decamped from the field of battle and moved to Cross Creek. The army was obliged to pass a long way through a perfect desert, where there was neither provisions for their subsistence, nor water sufficient to carry the mills, even could they have procured a supply of corn. At the same time, he had reason to expect that the whole country east of the Santee and Pedee would be in arms against them, notwithstanding his previous proclamation and promise of pardon on his leaving Gifford. He wrote Sir Henry Clinton after his arrival at Wilmington that he had reason to suppose many who had taken part in the rebellion had been convinced of their error, and were desirous to return to their duty and allegiance, that he had promised them pardon, with few exceptions, on the surrenderings of themselves, their arms and ammunition, and that they should be permitted to return home on giving a military parole, that their persons and property should be protected from violence, and as soon as possible, that they should be restored to all the privileges of legal and constitutional government. These specious promises had little effect on the alienated inhabitants. No allurements could induce them to join heartily in assisting the British commander to subjugate their native land. Their defection daily increased, and a more thorough aversion to the designs and the authority of the British government almost universally appeared. This his lordship himself attested. He observed afterwards in a letter to Sir Henry Clinton that, after the complete victory at Gifford, his numbers did not increase, though he had stayed 2 days near the field of action. His lordship acknowledged that though he had marched through the part of the country where he had reason to suppose he had the most friends, he found himself equally disappointed and mortified. He observed that many of the inhabitants rode into camp, shook me by the hand, said they were glad to see me and to hear that we had beaten Greene, and then rode home again, for I could not get 100 men in all the Regulators' country to stay with me, even as militia. Footnote. See Lord Cornwallis's letter to Sir Henry Clinton, April 10, 1780. End of footnote. This must have been a very unpleasant prelude to his lordship's march through a forlorn wilderness, interspersed with deep rivers, which must greatly impede an army encumbered with sick and wounded, who were many of them obliged to travel in wagons, while all were scantily provided with clothes, shoes, or provisions. But notwithstanding all impediments, they reached Wilmington the 7th of April. There the commander found new sources of anxiety. He felt his apprehensions increased on account of the situation of Lord Rawdon, on whom the command had devolved, when Lord Cornwallis left Gifford. He had left with him only 900 men, but whatever dangers his little army might be exposed to from the pursuit of General Greene, which was now ascertained, it was impossible for Lord Cornwallis to tread back his steps to their assistance. These considerations determined his lordship to take the advantage of General Greene's having left the back part of Virginia open, to march immediately into that state. As he had received express injunctions from Sir Henry Clinton to leave the Carolinas as soon as possible, and repaired to Virginia to the aid of General Phillips, it was his opinion that his own movements were not optional. This officer had been sent forward to the Chesapeake with a reinforcement in order to support the measure Sir Henry Clinton had, early in the preceding winter, adopted and for a time had entrusted General Arnold to prosecute. Previous to Lord Cornwallis's removal from Wilmington, he wrote General Phillips that he was in great distress at the reflection that General Greene had taken the advantage of his absence and had marched toward South Carolina, that he had endeavored to warn Lord Rawdon of this danger, but that he had reason to think his dispatches had been intercepted. He observed that the mountaineers and militia had poured into the back parts of that province, and he much feared that Lord Rawdon's posts would be so distant from each other, and his troops so scattered, as to put him into the greatest danger of being beat in detail, and that the worst of consequences might happen to most of the troops out of Charleston. By a direct move towards Camden, I cannot get there time enough to relieve Lord Rawdon, and should he have fallen, My army would be exposed to the utmost dangers from the great rivers I should have to pass, the exhausted state of the country, the numerous militia, the almost universal spirit of revolt which prevails in South Carolina, and the strength of Greene's army, whose Continentals alone are almost as numerous as I am. His lordship seemed, however, determined to make a feint in favor of Lord Rawdon by moving towards Hillsborough, yet he did not seem to expect much advantage could result therefrom. His situation was such that he appeared embarrassed in his decisions, nor could he easily determine, under the difficulty of existing circumstances, what line of conduct would best promote the general cause in which he was engaged. In Lord Cornwallis's letter to General Phillips, from which an extract is given above, dated Wilmington, April 24, 1781, he informed him that an attempt to march from thence to Virginia was exceedingly hazardous, and that many unforeseen difficulties might render it totally impracticable, that he should, however, endeavor to surmount them, and as soon as possible attempt to march to the Roanoke. In the meantime, he cautioned General Phillips to take no steps that might expose the army with him to ruin, if in any event their junction should be retarded. He urged him to transmit the earliest intelligence from time to time, until circumstances should admit of his meeting him at Petersburg. General Washington, soon after Arnold's embarkation from New York, had ordered a detachment of Continental troops under the command of the Marquis de Lafayette to follow, to watch the motions, and if possible to defeat the sanguinary purposes of this newly converted agent, to execute the designs of their enemies and waste the blood of his countrymen. A French squadron had lately arrived at Rhode Island, a part of which it was expected would soon repair to the Chesapeake under an able and experienced naval commander, the Count de Barras. High expectations were formed by every class of Americans that the assistance of France this year would be sufficient to enable the armies of the United States to counteract, if not to defeat, the designs of the British commanders in their several departments. Sir Henry Clinton, apprised of these circumstances, and very apprehensive for the safety of his friends in Virginia, judged it necessary there should be no further delay in sending a more respectable force to that quarter to strengthen the hands of General Arnold. Arnold had, on his first arrival in Virginia, landed at Westover and marched to Richmond, destroying all before him, with little or no opposition. He was assisted in his marauding exploits by Colonel Simcoe, who marched from Richmond to Weston, and there destroyed one of the finest foundries for cannon in all America. They burnt, plundered, and destroyed everything before them as they moved. Yet Sir Henry Clinton was convinced that their numbers were not sufficient to facilitate his wishes and subdue the state without a more strong and respectable force. In consequence of this determination, he had ordered Major General Phillips with 4,000 men to repair immediately to Virginia to succor Arnold. He likewise had directed Lord Cornwallis to form a junction with General Phillips as soon as the affairs of Carolina would admit of his transferring his command there, and leaving that state. But some expressions in the order, it seemed to be left discretionary with his lordship to move when and where he thought proper. Yet in consequence of this call and the reasons annexed thereto, he thought himself obligated to hasten his march to meet General Phillips, according to the directions of Sir Henry Clinton. Lord Cornwallis, notwithstanding all the discouraging circumstances which he had encountered, and which at times still seemed to increase before him, did not lose sight of the objects of conquest, victory, and glory to be acquired in Virginia. So prone is man to anticipate the completion of his own wishes, that he continues to cherish them, even after probabilities cease to exist. Thus the confidence his lordship had in the military abilities of Lord Rawdon, the repeated defeat of General Greene, and the broken state of his army, from the frequent instances of flight and desertion, still flattered him with ideas that the Carolinas might yet be subdued. These considerations induced him to hasten his march toward the state of Virginia. His troops were indeed in a miserable condition for a march of 300 miles in a hostile country, where they could not avail themselves of its produce, however necessary for their subsistence, without being impeded by skirmishing parties. Both the cavalry and infantry were in a very destitute situation with regard to forage, provisions, and clothing, but these were not impediments sufficient to stop the progress of veteran troops, with an able commander at their head. They began their march on the 25th of April and arrived at Petersburg on the 20th of May. End of section 42. Section 43 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 20, Part 2. The route from Gifford to Wilmington and from Wilmington to Petersburg was attended with unusual fatigue and difficulty, yet Lord Cornwallis moved with cheerfulness and alacrity, supported by the sanguine expectation and pleasing idea of triumph in the reduction of Virginia, in addition to the conquest of the Carolinas. Groundless as were these expectations, his lordship at that time flattered himself that the work of subduing the Carolinas was nearly finished, and that they should soon only have to take measures for retaining in obedience those turbulent and refractory states. But when he had completed his march and arrived at the destined spot that opened to his imagination new scenes of glory and victory, he found on every side embarrassments that he had not contemplated, and disappointments that wounded both his personal feelings as a friend and his military pride as an officer. He met at Petersburg the melancholy tidings of the death of General Phillips, from whose acknowledged military talents and experience he had reason to expect advice and assistance in every exigence. This brave and judicious officer, who had so often staked his life in the field of battle, fell a victim to sickness. Lord Cornwallis had no opinion of Arnold. He despised him as a man or an officer, and hated him as a traitor. He wrote Sir Henry Clinton that experience had made him less sanguine, and that more arrangements were necessary for so important an expedition as the present than had ever occurred to General Arnold. To this his lordship added many other expressions of contempt and disgust for this new favorite of the British commander-in-chief. It is not strange that many officers among the gallant troops of Great Britain, men of name and distinction, should be much chagrined at the rank given to, and the confidence placed in, this unprincipled minion. Before his death it had appeared that Major General Phillips, who had formerly suffered by the bravery of Arnold and his associates, was manifestly piqued at the attention paid to his advice and the anxiety shown by Sir Henry Clinton for his safety. Phillips had but recently obtained his liberty after the Convention of Saratoga, exchanged for General Lincoln. This expedition to Virginia was his first command of any magnitude after his release. He found in the orders received from General Clinton some mortifying expressions, and a letter that accompanied them contained still more. Clinton had indiscreetly intimated therein to General Phillips that the security of Arnold and his troops at Elizabeth River was the principal object of Phillips' expedition to Virginia. For this expression, General Clinton found himself afterwards obliged to apologize. It was deemed grossly affrontive to a high-spirited officer of the rank, merits, and military abilities possessed by General Phillips. From the circumstances already related, it appears clearly that Lord Cornwallis's route from Charleston to Virginia was long, hazardous, and fatiguing. He had not traversed less than 11 or 1,200 miles when he reached Copeland on James River, including the necessary circuitous marches he was obliged to make to avoid rivers, rapids, mountains, and other impediments to ease or expedition in traveling. From this place he wrote some of his most desponding and discontented letters to General Clinton. He found the British troops scattered in small detachments and posted at a distance from each other in various parts of the country. He observed to Sir Henry Clinton, "One maxim appears to me to be absolutely necessary for the safe and honorable conduct of this war, which is, that we should have as few posts as possible, and that wherever the king's troops are, they should be in respectable force. By the vigorous exertions of the present governors of America, large bodies of men are soon collected, and I have too often observed that when a storm threatens, our friends disappear." Before Lord Cornwallis left Cobham, he observed in a letter to General Clinton that he wished to call his attention to the inutility of a stand at an offensive post that could have no influence on the war that still existed in Carolina, and that only gave them a few acres of unhealthy swamp in Virginia, liable at any time to become a prey to the enemy without any superiority of force. Footnote: Lord Cornwallis's letter from Cobham, James River. End of footnote. From his first arrival in Virginia, he had declined acting with General Arnold, but he was not long mortified with the sight or the society of a man he so much detested. He did not reach Petersburg till the 20th of May, and in the beginning of June he was relieved from an associate so disagreeable to the feelings of a man of honor by Arnold's return to New York. Sir Henry Clinton had various reasons for the recall of this officer. These he did not announce, but he doubtless thought that from his constitutional boldness and the desperate situation in which he would be found if defeated by the Americans, that Arnold would be a useful agent if New York should be seriously attacked. But the principal design appeared soon after to be that of employing him in a business for which he was peculiarly calculated: the surprise, the plundering, and burning the plantations and defenseless towns on the sea-coast of the state of Connecticut and other places. The unexpected and much lamented death of General Phillips, and the recall of General Arnold, a man held odious by Cornwallis in every point of view, left his lordship the sole responsibility for events in Virginia, and perhaps the movements and termination of the campaign there were conducted with as much judgment, ability, and military skill as could have been exhibited by any officer involved in similar difficulties and embarrassments. It was not many weeks after Lord Cornwallis arrived in Virginia before the intelligence he received from the southward filled him with the most serious and alarming apprehensions for the safety of Lord Rawdon. He found by the most authenticated accounts that General Greene had taken the advantage of his absence and had moved with all possible expedition toward the environs of Charleston, that success had attended his maneuvers in various instances, and that Lord Rawdon had as frequently been disappointed in his systems. To return and follow him was impracticable, though in his opinion the Carolinas were in the utmost danger of being lost to Great Britain. Yet the work assigned him in Virginia required the talents and the vigilance of the ablest commander. On his arrival in that state, he found the Americans in high spirits, and their troops strongly posted on the most convenient grounds. He found that General Arnold had done little to facilitate the conquest of Virginia. He had indeed burned several houses, destroyed some stores, and murdered many of the inhabitants. But no consistent plan of conquest appeared to have been either arranged or executed. His lordship also felt heavily the death of General Phillips, from whom he expected much information and advice in the critical emergencies that opened upon him the farther he advanced. The orders of General Clinton were peremptory, and to Cornwallis appeared inscrutable. And in addition to the list of perplexities and disappointments that daily thickened upon him, he received orders from Sir Henry Clinton to send on a part of his troops for the defense of New York, which he still apprehended would soon be attacked by the combined armies of France and America. Thus, embarrassed on every side, his own systems deranged, his judgment slighted, and his opinions disregarded by the commander-in-chief, his lordship was evidently chagrined. Yet he lost not the vigilance or activity of an officer of distinguished valor, and soon made an effort to concentrate his troops, and to place the main body of his army in the post he judged best calculated for defense. In this he differed widely in opinion from Sir Henry Clinton, but finally took his stand at Yorktown, in obedience to the orders of the commander-in-chief. The Marquis de Lafayette had not been idle before the arrival of Lord Cornwallis, and afterwards aided by the judgment and experience of the Baron de Steuben, who arrived in the month of June. He kept the British troops in play for some time, but the number of his troops was inconsiderable, and most of them militiamen. They were easily routed in detached bodies by the more experienced partisans who opposed them. Besides many officers of superior name and character in the train of Lord Cornwallis, he was attended with very many who had no higher description of talent than what was necessary for sudden and bold invasion of the weak and defenseless, without any relentings or compassionate feelings towards the victims who fell into their hands. In a war like the present, they had many opportunities of indulging their propensities and exhibiting those talents. The violent and cruel vigilance of Colonel Tarleton is already too well known to require any comment. Among other British partisans of notoriety was a Colonel Hamilton, who had distinguished himself for his activity and his severity from Georgia to Virginia. Not less active than either of the above was a Colonel Simcoe, more remarkable for intrigue, stratagem, and surprise than for the cool operations of the commander of magnanimity. The courage which is accompanied by humanity is a virtue, but bravery that pushes through all dangers to destroy is barbarous, is savage, is brutal. These were the principal officers at this time that headed the detachments in most of the marauding parties that infested the state of Virginia. Simcoe had distinguished himself in this way through the Jerseys until taken prisoner by the Americans. When he recovered his liberty, he pursued the game and became so perfect in the art of coup de main that in one of his excursions in Virginia he eluded even the vigilance of the Baron Steuben, so far as to oblige him to remove with precipitation from an advantageous post, not without considerable loss. Lord Cornwallis himself details some of the heroic feats of this trio in a letter to Sir Henry Clinton, dated Williamsburg, June 30th. The principal design of his lordship was, by their movements, to prevent the junction of General Wayne, who was marching through Maryland to the assistance of the Marquis de Lafayette. He pushed his light troops over a river in haste, in order to effect this, if possible, finding it impracticable, and that in spite of all his efforts General Wayne had made good his march, and reached his intended post. He took the advantage of the Marquis passing the Rappahannock, and detached Lieutenant Colonel Simcoe and Tarleton to disturb the assembly of the state, then sitting at Charlottesville. The result of this excursion was the capture of several of the members of the assembly, and the waste of the continental stores in their quarter. They destroyed at Charlottesville, and on their return, 1,000 stand of arms, 500 barrels of powder, and a large quantity of other military accoutrements and provisions. End of section 43. Section 44 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 20, Part 3. The Baron Steuben had his station at this time at the Point of Fork. He was surprised and obliged to retreat after a short rencounter. Simcoe followed and used every exertion to attack his rear guard. Not effecting this, he destroyed as usual all the continental stores which lay in their way. There and in the places adjacent, the Americans lost 3,000 or 4,000 stand of arms, and a large quantity of powder and other stores. The Baron had with him in this affray about 800 men, mostly militia. After this, Lord Cornwallis moved himself to Williamsburg. There he gave fully and freely to Sir Henry Clinton his opinion of the only mode of effecting the security of South, and the reduction of North Carolina, which he found was expected from him both in England and America. He observed that, in his judgment, until Virginia was subdued, they could not reduce North Carolina, or have any certain hold of the back country of South Carolina, the want of navigation rendering it impossible to maintain a sufficient army in either of those provinces, at a considerable distance from the coast, and the men and riches of Virginia furnishing ample supplies to the rebel Southern army. I will not say much in praise of the militia of the Southern colonies, but the list of British officers and soldiers killed and wounded by them since last June proves but too fatally that they are not wholly contemptible. Footnote: see Lord Cornwallis's letter to General Clinton, dated Williamsburg, June 30th, 1781. End of footnote. It appears from all the correspondence and conferences between Sir Henry Clinton, General Phillips, and other officers that the British commander-in-chief had seriously contemplated an excursion to Philadelphia. He intimated in one of his letters to General Phillips, not long before his death, that they probably had more friends who would cooperate with them in the state of Pennsylvania than either in Maryland or Virginia. He seems to have been led to this opinion by the representations of a Colonel Rankin. He urged this as an experiment that would redound much to the advantage of Lord Cornwallis's operations in Virginia. General Clinton clearly discovered that he had a predilection, himself, in favor of the project. He asked the advice of the Generals Phillips and Arnold on the subject, after he had appeared to be predetermined to make the experiment. When it was disclosed to Lord Cornwallis by General Phillips' letters falling into his hands, he did not hesitate to remonstrate against drawing off 4,000 men from Virginia for service in the Delaware, in this critical exigence of affairs in all the more southern colonies. He observed in the same letter from which an extract is given above, that Sir Henry Clinton, being charged with the weight of the whole American war, his opinions, of course, were less partial, and were directed to all parts, and that to those opinions it was his duty implicitly to submit. He then adds that, being in the place of General Phillips, I thought myself called upon by you to give my opinion on the attempt upon Philadelphia. Having experienced much disappointment on that head, I own I would cautiously engage in measures depending materially for their success on the active assistance from the country, and I thought the attempt on Philadelphia would do more harm than good to the cause of Britain, because, supposing it practicable to get possession of the town, which besides other obstacles, if the redoubts are kept up, would not be easy, we could not hope to arrive without their having had sufficient warning of our approach, to enable them to secure specie and the greatest part of their valuable public stores by means of their boats and shipping. The difficulty of discriminating friends from foes in Philadelphia the improbability that they could continue long there if they succeeded, the stronger necessity for all the troops that could be spared from New York to act in Virginia, and the hazard that would attend an attack on Philadelphia, were circumstances that induced Lord Cornwallis very judiciously to portray them in his letters to Sir Henry Clinton as an object where the balance of the risk far outweighed any promise of advantage. It may easily be supposed that those free opinions and advice, which he considered as obtruded, could not be very acceptable to the Commander-in-Chief at New York, more especially as it was evident there had long existed heartburnings and jealousies between Sir Henry Clinton and Lord Cornwallis. These were heightened by the warm altercations between them, with regard to the most convenient and advantageous posts for defense, as well as the arrangements for offensive operations. The encampment of the Marquis de Lafayette was at this time about 18 or 20 miles from Williamsburg. He had with him about 2,000 men. This was a number far too short for any offensive movements against such a strong and forcible British army as was then posted in Virginia. He was in impatient expectation of reinforcements, which he had now reason to conclude as certain, from the junction of the American and French troops commanded by the Count de Rochambeau. But the Marquis was obliged to act again, before there was time for his relief by the arrival of his friends. Lord Cornwallis endeavored before the middle of July to cross James River and pass his army to Portsmouth. The Marquis de Lafayette sent forward the Pennsylvania line, with some other detachments, to impede their passage. This brought on a smart engagement, which terminated with considerable loss of both sides. The approach of evening, with other disadvantageous circumstances, obliged the Americans to retreat, leaving the few cannon they had with them behind. The darkness of the night prevented a pursuit. The next day the British passed the river, but not without some difficulty from its width, which was about 3 miles. The Marquis Lafayette, through the difficulties which he had to encounter in Virginia, had on all occasions conducted with more valor, caution, prudence, and judgment than could have been expected from so young an officer. When the Baron de Steuben joined him in the month of June, he had few men under his command except the militia, whose numbers were indeterminate, and the time of their continuance in service always uncertain. Yet much generalship and military address had been shown on various occasions, both by the young hero and the aged veteran. They through all the summer opposed the vigilance and superior force of Lord Cornwallis with great courage and dexterity. Lord Cornwallis had made several judicious attempts to surprise the Marquis with his little armament, consisting, as his lordship occasionally observed, mostly of unarmed peasantry. But wary and brave, his ability and judgment had supplied the deficiencies and balanced the weakness of his detachment, and before the arrival of the generals Washington and Rochambeau, the Marquis de Lafayette had rendered very essential service to the American cause by his valor and firmness in the state of Virginia. Lord Cornwallis had been but a few days at Portsmouth before he received a letter from Sir Henry Clinton, censuring him in direct terms for attempting to pass James River and taking a stand at Portsmouth, though he had before recommended this to General Phillips as a convenient post. He observed that he had flattered himself until he had the honor to receive his lordship's letter on the 8th of July, that upon reconsidering the general purport of our correspondence and General Phillips' papers in your possession, you would at least have waited for a line from me in answer to your letter of the 30th ultimo, before you finally determined upon so serious and mortifying a move as the repassing James River and retiring with your army to Portsmouth. And I was the more induced to hope that this would have been the case, as we both seemed to agree in our opinion of the propriety of taking a healthy station on the neck between York and James Rivers, for the purpose of covering a proper harbor for our line of battleships. Through all his correspondences, orders, commands, countermands, and indecision during the present summer, no man ever appeared more embarrassed or more totally at a loss how to arrange his military maneuvers than did General Clinton. He appeared at times to consider the reduction of Virginia as primary object, and that it was of the highest importance that Lord Cornwallis should be there strengthened and supported, both by sea and land. At other periods, he treated the operations there in so light a manner that his ideas could not be comprehended, even by so intelligent an officer as Lord Cornwallis. It was not more than 3 or 4 weeks previous to the date of the above letter that Sir Henry Clinton had pressed his lordship as if in a sudden fright to send him 2,000 troops to aid in the defense of New York, and, as if under some panic-struck influence, he said, "The sooner they are sent, the better, unless your lordship may have adopted my plan to move to Baltimore or the Delaware Neck and put yourself in a way to cooperate with us. But even in that case, you can spare us something, I suppose. From all the letters I have seen, I am of opinion, if circumstances of provision, stores, etc., turn out as they wish, that the enemy will certainly attack this post. As for men for such an object in this, circumstanced as they suppose it to be, it cannot be doubted that they can raise a sufficient number." Sir Henry Clinton had found by an intercepted letter that there were 8,000 men collected at West Point, and that others were coming in very fast. He informed Cornwallis that he had certain intelligence that Admiral Barras had sailed from Rhode Island, that many circumstances had put it beyond a doubt that the design was to form a junction between him and General Washington, and that they meditated an attempt on the post at New York. It is needless to detail much more the correspondences of the British officers acting at this time in America. Their characters are sufficiently elucidated, not only by their own letters, but by subsequent transactions. It is enough to observe that by the correspondence of the general officers, afterwards published in England, it clearly appears that they did not harmonize in opinion. Their counsels at this time were confused, and their plans indecisive. End of section 44. Section 45 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 20, Conclusion. Yet it is worthy of notice that distrust, dissension, and vilification were kept up equally between some of the British naval commanders and Sir Henry Clinton. In one of his confidential letters he complained that all opportunities of advantage were impeded or lost by the slowness and obstinacy of the admiral. He observed that his strange conduct had, if possible, been more inscrutable than ever. At one time, he declared he was immediately going home. At another, he had sworn that he knew nothing of his recall. In a secret and confidential letter to General Phillips, Sir Henry Clinton assured him that if he was not better satisfied by the next post, relative to the recall of Admiral Graves, he should probably leave the management of him solely to Lord Cornwallis. Footnote. See General Clinton's vindicatory letter. End of footnote. In this letter he censured his lordship in direct terms for leaving the Carolinas, but half subdued, to pursue the chimerical project of doubtful conquest in Virginia. He asserted that his invitation, not his commands to his lordship, to come to the Chesapeake, was on the supposition that everything was settled in the Carolinas, agreeably to the wishes of administration, and the designs of the government of England. Sure of the confidence of General Phillips, Sir Henry Clinton expressed the utmost astonishment that, with 9 British battalions, a legion of infantry, a detachment of Yagers, 5 Hessian and several provincial battalions, some American light horse, and large detachments of artillery and dragoons, that Lord Cornwallis should yet pretend that he wanted forces sufficient for the most solid operations in Virginia. Footnote: General Clinton's letter to Major General Phillips, April 1781, printed in England with his other letters. End of footnote. He sneered at his lordship's idea that it was impossible to act with his army in Carolina without the assistance of friends. This reflection alluded to a letter received by him in which Lord Cornwallis observed that the royal cause had few friends in that country, and that when a storm threatened, even those few disappeared. An historian has observed that Kosciusko relinquished the Colchian War in the just persuasion that it is impossible to hold a distant country against the wishes and efforts of its inhabitants. Footnote: given on the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. End of footnote. His lordship might probably be of the same opinion. This opinion was justified by his own experience, and too many mortifying instances for the tranquillity of a man of his sensibility. It has been above observed that by the sudden death of General Phillips, all these letters fell into the hands of Lord Cornwallis, with several others of the same style and tenor. This circumstance greatly aggravated the dissension and disgust between the commanding officers in New York and Virginia. Yet, notwithstanding the implied censure or reproach which they contained, in most of Sir Henry Clinton's letters afterwards to Lord Cornwallis, he had written with great complacence, and had expressed the highest confidence in his lordship's abilities and judgment, but the breach became irreconcilable. Through the whole business, Lord Cornwallis constantly affirmed that his force was insufficient even for defensive operations. He took the liberty to intimate to Sir Henry Clinton that notwithstanding there had been a call for a part of his troops for the defense of New York, that he had never been under any apprehensions for the safety of that city. With the same freedom, he remonstrated against a plan that had been meditated by the commander-in-chief at New York for an attack on the city of Philadelphia. His lordship asserted with some degree of warmth that it appeared to him highly imprudent that any part of his army should be detached for that or any other purpose. But he observed further that in his subordinate situation, unacquainted with the instructions of administration, ignorant of the forces under the command of His Excellency General Clinton, and without the power of making arrangements, he could only offer his opinion, that plans of execution must come from himself, who had the materials for forming as well as the power of executing. These remonstrances had little weight with the British commander-in-chief. It appears through all the correspondence that these gentlemen differed very widely in opinion with regard to the modes of action, the numbers necessary for effective execution, the best posts for defense, and indeed in the general plan of all their operations. However, Sir Henry Clinton still kept up the idea of supporting the war in Virginia, and of aiding Lord Cornwallis to the utmost, notwithstanding he had sent an order to draw off part of his troops. After he was thoroughly alarmed at the hazardous situation of the commander in Virginia, he relinquished his chimerical project of attacking Philadelphia. He countermanded the orders for drawing off a considerable part of the troops, and endeavored to hasten on a small squadron of British ships then lying at Sandy Hook. He flattered himself that a few ships under the flag of Britain might intercept the fleet and interrupt the designs of Admiral Barras, who had sailed from Rhode Island, or retard a still more important object, the arrival of the Count de Graaf in the Chesapeake, where he was hourly expected. He made some other ineffectual efforts for the relief of the British army, which was soon after cooped up by a large French fleet that arrived within the Capes. The dissension, discordant division of opinion among the British officers was not all that occasioned the fatal delay of strengthening Lord Cornwallis in Virginia. It may be ascribed more to that atmosphere of doubt in which Sir Henry Clinton was involved. Irresolute measures are ever the result of a confusion of ideas. The vast object of reducing such a wide extended country and setting the wheels of operation in motion, so as to work with equal facility from Georgia to Virginia, from Virginia to the north, and from Canada to the eastern extreme, was of too wide an extent for the compass of his ability. His mind seemed for a time to be plunged in a chaos, uncertain where to begin in the complicated difficulties of his official duties, or where to set the strongest materials of his machinery to work in all its parts, in a manner that would produce a complete system of conquest through the United States. There was no deficiency of courage, ardor, or fidelity to their master among the officers of the crown, however dissension in opinion with regard to the modes of execution. But these dissensions prevented that ready cooperation in action which is necessary both to defeat the designs of their enemies and to complete their own systems by judicious and prompt decision, and the immediate execution of well-digested plans. The movements of the Continental and French army had alarmed Sir Henry Clinton to such a degree that he long persisted in his determination of recalling a part of the troops from Virginia for the immediate defense of New York. He informed Lord Cornwallis that General Washington had with him 8,000 or 10,000 men, besides the French battalions, and observed that everyone acquainted with the disposition of the inhabitants east of the Hudson must be sensible in what manner their appearance would affect the numerous and warlike militia of New England states. Sir Henry Clinton, doubtful of the farther success of Lord Cornwallis, apprehensive of an immediate assault on New York, and reasonably calculating the numbers in array against him as very far superior to his own, lost sight for a time of the dangerous situation of Lord Cornwallis and the army in Virginia. To complete the agitation of his mind, he was now trembling for his sinking reputation, which had been severely attacked in England. From these circumstances, his despondency was nearly equal to his irresolution. Yet, apparent necessity awakened his energy for the defense of the city of New York, and every possible step was taken to meet the combined troops in a manner becoming a British veteran commander. Lord Cornwallis, with very different ideas, was parrying the attacks of the Americans then in Virginia, and preparing as far as possible for the resistance of stronger bodies of enemies. He was persuaded that General Washington and the Count de Rochambeau, aided by a powerful French fleet, had deeper laid systems and were on the point of disclosing designs of higher magnitude and more important consequences than had ever been apprehended by Sir Henry Clinton. The variety of smaller skirmishes, retreats, reprisals, and unexpected encounters that took place on the different rivers and posts in Virginia may at present be left to advert more particularly to the difficulties Lord Cornwallis had to contend with, and the dangers he had to combat, previous to the decision of his fortune in that quarter. He had for a time taken his stand at Portsmouth, but he left that station as soon as possible, and according to orders from the Commander-in-Chief, concentrated his forces at Yorktown and Gloucester towards the close of summer, much against his own judgment. We have seen that by the indecision of General Clinton, the delay of reinforcements both by land and sea, and the general defection and disgust of the Virginians to any appearance of the authority of the Crown of Britain, there were causes sufficient to discourage an officer who was ambitious to act with vigor and promptitude. But these were far from comprising the whole of the gloomy prospect which lay before Lord Cornwallis. He had the highest reason to expect the approach of General Washington, accompanied by the experienced and renowned Rochambeau. At the same time, He had well-grounded expectations of a French fleet in the Chesapeake to counteract any naval operations on the part of Britain. This combination of dangers, added to the inconvenient and indefensible post his lordship was impelled to take, reduced him to the most perplexed and embarrassed state of mind. Yet he supported himself with firmness and magnanimity until new and inextricable difficulties led him to despair of the success of the campaign. This was apparent by the tenor of his letters, as well as by his general deportment. For some time previous to the catastrophe of the fatal day, which reduced a nobleman of the first rank, an officer of the highest military fame and pride, to the condition of a prisoner. End of Volume 2. End of Section 45. Section 46 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2, by Mercy Otis Warren. Articles of Confederation. Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union between the states of New Hampshire, Massachusetts Bay, Rhode Island and Providence Plantations, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Article 1. The style of this confederacy shall be the United States of America. Article 2. Each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and every power, jurisdiction, and right, which is not by this confederation expressly delegated to the United States in Congress assembled. Article 3. The said states hereby severally enter into a firm league of friendship with each other, for their common defense, the security of their liberties, and their mutual and general welfare, binding themselves to assist each other against all force offered to, or attacks made upon them, or any of them, on account of religion, sovereignty, trade, or any other pretense whatever. Article 4. The better to secure and perpetuate mutual friendship and intercourse among the people of the different states in this union, the free inhabitants of each of these states, paupers, vagabonds, and fugitives from justice excepted, shall be entitled to all privileges and immunities of free citizens in the several states, and the people of each state shall have free ingress and regress to and from any other state, and shall enjoy therein all the privileges of trade and commerce, subject to the same duties, impositions, and restrictions as the inhabitants thereof respectively, provided that such restrictions shall not extend so far as to prevent the removal of property imported into any state to any other state of which the owner is an inhabitant, provided also that no imposition, duties, or restrictions shall be laid by any state on the property of the United States, or either of them. If any person guilty of, or charged with, treason, felony, or other high misdemeanors in any state shall flee from justice, and be found in any of the United States, he shall, upon demand of the governor or executive power of the state from which he fled, be delivered up and removed to the state having jurisdiction of his offense. Full faith and credit shall be given in each of these states to the records, acts, and judicial proceedings of the courts and magistrates of every other state. Article 5. For the more convenient management of the general interest of the United States, delegates shall be annually appointed, in such manner as the legislature of each state shall direct, to meet in Congress on the first Monday in November in every year, with a power reserved to each state to recall its delegates or any of them at any time within the year, and to send others in their stead for the remainder of the year. No state shall be represented in Congress by less than 2, nor by more than 7 members, and no person shall be capable of being a delegate for more than 3 years in any term of 6 years, nor shall any person, being a delegate, be capable of holding any office under the United States for which he, or another for his benefit, receives any salary, fees, or emolument of any kind. Each state shall maintain its own delegates in a meeting of the states, and while they act as members of the Committee of the States. In determining questions in the United States and Congress assembled, each state shall have 1 vote. Freedom of speech and debate in Congress shall not be impeached or questioned in any court or place out of Congress, and the members of Congress shall be protected in their persons from arrest and imprisonments during the time of their going to and from and attendance on Congress, except for treason, felony, or breach of the peace. Article 6. No state, without the consent of the United States in Congress assembled, shall send any embassy to or receive any embassy from, or enter into any conference, agreement, alliance, or treaty with any king, prince, or state, nor shall any person holding any office of profit or trust under the United States or any of them, except of any present, emolument, office, or title, of any kind whatever from any king, prince, or foreign state, nor shall the United States and Congress assembled, or any of them, grant any title of nobility. No 2 or more states shall enter into any treaty, confederation, or alliance, whatever between them, without the consent of the United States and Congress assembled, specifying accurately the purposes for which the same is to be entered into and how long it shall continue. No state shall lay any imposts or duties which may interfere with any stipulations and treaties entered into by the United States and Congress assembled, with any king, prince, or state, in pursuance of any treaties already proposed by Congress to the courts of France and Spain. No vessels of war shall be kept up in time of peace by any state, except such numbers only as shall be deemed necessary by the United States and Congress assembled, for the defense of such state or its trade. Nor shall any body of forces be kept up by any state in time of peace, except such number only as, in the judgment of the United States and Congress assembled, shall be deemed requisite to garrison the forts necessary for the defense of such state. But every state shall always keep up a well-regulated and disciplined militia, sufficiently armed and occluded, and shall provide and constantly have ready for use, in public stores, a due number of field pieces and tents, and a proper quantity of arms, ammunition, and camp equipage. No state shall engage in any war without the consent of the United States and Congress assembled, unless such state be actually invaded by enemies, or shall have received certain advice of a resolution being formed by some nation of Indians to invade such state, and the danger is so imminent as not to admit of a delay till the United States and Congress assembled can be consulted. Nor shall any state grant commissions to any ships or vessels of war, nor letters of marque or reprisal, except it be after a declaration of war by the United States and Congress assembled, and then only against the kingdom or state, and the subjects thereof, against which war has been so declared, and under such regulations as shall be established by the United States and Congress assembled, unless such state shall be infested by pirates, in which case vessels of war may be fitted out for that occasion, and kept so long as the danger shall continue, or until the United States and Congress assembled shall determine other ways. Article 7. When land forces are raised by any state for the common defense, all officers of or under the rank of colonel shall be appointed by the legislature of each state respectively, by whom such forces shall be raised, or in such manner as such state shall direct, and all vacancies shall be filled up by the state which first made the appointment. Article 8. All charges of war and all other expenses that shall be incurred for the common defense, or general welfare, and allowed by the United States and Congress assembled, shall be defrayed out of a common treasury, which shall be supplied by the several states, in proportion to the value of all land within each state, granted to or surveyed for any person, as such land and the buildings and improvements thereon shall be estimated, according to such mode as the United States in Congress assembled shall, from time to time, direct and appoint. The taxes for paying that proportion shall be laid and levied by the authority and direction of the legislatures of the several states, within the time agreed upon by the United States in Congress assembled. Article 9. The United States in Congress assembled shall have the sole and exclusive right and power of determining on peace and war, except in the cases mentioned in the 6th article, or sending and receiving ambassadors, entering into treaties and alliances, provided that no treaty of commerce shall be made, whereby the legislative powers of the respective states shall be restrained from imposing such imposts and duties on foreigners as their own people is subjected to, or for prohibiting the exportation or importation of any species of good or commodities whatsoever, of establishing rules for deciding in all cases what captures on land or water shall be legal, and in what manner prizes taken by land or naval forces in the service of the United States shall be divided or appropriated, of granting letters of marque or reprisal in times of peace, appointing courts for the trial of piracies and felonies committed on the high seas, and establishing courts for receiving and determining finally appeals in all cases of capture, provided that no member of Congress shall be appointed a judge of any of the said courts. The United States in Congress assembled shall also be the last resort on appeal in all disputes and differences now subsisting, or that hereafter may arise, between two or more states concerning boundary, jurisdiction, or any other cause whatever, which authority shall always be exercised in the manner following. Whenever the legislative or executive authority or lawful agent of any state in controversy with another shall present a petition to Congress stating the matter in question and praying for a hearing, notice thereof shall be given by order of Congress to the legislative or executive authority of the other state in controversy, and a day assigned for the appearance of the parties by their lawful agents, who shall then be directed to appoint by joint consent commissioners or judges to constitute a court for hearing and determining the matter in question. But if they cannot agree, Congress shall name 3 persons out of each of the United States, and from the list of such persons each party shall alternately strike out 1, the petitioners beginning, until the number shall be reduced to 13, and from that number not less than 7, nor more than 9 names, as Congress shall direct, shall in the presence of Congress be drawn out by lot, and the persons whose names shall be so drawn, or any 5 of them, shall be commissioners or judges, to hear and finally determine the controversy, so always as a major part of the judges who shall hear the cause shall agree in the determination. And if either party shall neglect to attend at the day appointed, without showing reasons, which Congress shall judge sufficient, or being present shall refuse to strike, the Congress shall proceed to nominate 3 persons out of each state, and the Secretary of Congress shall strike in behalf of such party, absent or refusing, and the judgment and sentence of the court to be appointed, in the manner before prescribed, shall be final and conclusive. And if any of the parties shall refuse to submit to the authority of such court, or to appear or defend their claim or cause, the court shall nevertheless proceed to pronounce sentence or judgment, which shall in like manner be final and decisive. The judgment of sentence and other proceedings being in either case transmitted to Congress, and lodged among the acts of Congress for the security of the parties concerned, provided that every commissioner, before he sits in judgment, shall take an oath to be administered by one of the judges of the Supreme or Superior Court of the state, where the cause shall be tried, well and truly to hear and determine the matter in question, according to the best of his judgment, without favor, affection, or hope of reward. Provided also that no state shall be deprived of territory for the benefit of the United States. All controversies concerning the private right of soil claimed under different grants of two or more states, whose jurisdictions as they may respect such lands, and the states which pass such grants are adjusted, the said grants or either of them being at the same time claimed to have originated antecedent to such settlement of jurisdiction, shall on the petition of either party to the Congress of the United States be finally determined as near as may be in the same manner as is before prescribed for deciding disputes respecting territorial jurisdiction between states. The United States and Congress assembled shall also have the sole and exclusive right and power of regulating the alloy and value of coin struck by their own authority, or by that of the respective states, fixing the standard of weights and measures throughout the United States, regulating the trade and managing all affairs with the Indians, not members of any of the states, provided that the legislative right of any state within its own limits be not infringed or violated, establishing and regulating post offices from one state to another throughout all the United States, and exacting such postage on the papers passing through the same as may be requisite to defray the expenses of the said office, appointing all officers of the land forces in the service of the United States, excepting regimental officers, appointing all the officers of the naval forces, and commissioning all officers whatever in the service of the United States, making rules for the government and regulation of the said land and naval forces, and directing their operations. The United States and Congress assembled shall have authority to appoint a committee to sit in the recess of Congress, to be denominated a committee of the states, and to consist of one delegate from each state, and to appoint such other committees and civil officers as may be necessary for managing the general affairs of the United States under their direction, to appoint one of their number to preside, provided that no person be allowed to serve in the office of president more than 1 year in any term of 3 years, to ascertain the necessary sums of money to be raised for the service of the United States, and to appropriate and apply the same for defraying the public expenses, to borrow money or emit bills on the credit of the United States, transmitting every half year to the respective states an account of the sums of money so borrowed or emitted, to build and equip a navy, to agree upon the number of land forces, and to make requisitions from each state for its quota, in proportion to the number of white inhabitants in such state, which requisition shall be binding, and thereupon the legislature of each state shall appoint the regimental officers, raise the men, and clothe, arm, and equip them in soldier-like manner, at the expense of the United States, and the officers and men so clothed, armed, and equipped shall march to the place appointed, and within the time agreed on by the United States and Congress assembled. But if the United States and Congress assembled shall, on consideration of circumstances, judge proper that any state should not raise men, or should raise a smaller number than its quota, and that any other state shall raise a greater number of men than the quota thereof, such extra number shall be raised, officered, clothed, armed, and equipped, in the same manner as the quota of such state, unless the legislature of such state shall judge that such extra number cannot be safely spared out of the same, in which case they shall raise, officer, clothe, arm, and equip as many of such extra number as they judge can be safely spared. And the officers and men so clothed, armed, and equipped shall march to the place appointed, and within the time agreed on by the United States and Congress assembled. The United States and Congress assembled shall never engage in a war, nor grant letters of marque and reprisal in time of peace, nor enter into any treaties or alliances, nor coin money, nor regulate the value thereof, nor ascertain the sums and expenses necessary for the defense and welfare of the United States, or any of them, nor emit bills, nor borrow money on the credit of the United States, nor appropriate money, nor agree upon the number of vessels of war to be built or purchased, or the number of land or sea forces to be raised, nor appoint a commander-in-chief of the army or navy, unless 9 states assent to the same. Nor shall a question on any other point, except for adjourning from day to day, be determined, unless by the votes of a majority of the United States in Congress assembled. The Congress of the United States shall have power to adjourn to any time within the year, and to any place within the United States, so that no period of adjournment be for a longer duration than the space of 6 months, and shall publish the journal of their proceedings monthly, except such parts thereof relating to treaties, alliances, or military operations, as in their judgment require secrecy. And the yeas and nays of the delegates of each state on any question shall be entered on the journal, when it is desired by any delegate, and the delegates of a state or any of them, at his or their request, shall be furnished with the transcript of the said journal, except such parts as are above accepted, to lay before the legislatures of the several states. Article 10. The committee of the states, or any 9 of them, shall be authorized to execute in the recess of Congress. Such are the powers of Congress as the United States in Congress assembled, by the consent of 9 states, shall from time to time think expedient to vest them with, provided that no power be delegated to the said committee, for the exercise of which, by the Articles of Confederation, the voice of 9 states in the Congress of the United States assembled is requisite. Article 11. Canada acceding to this Confederation and joining in the measures of the United States shall be admitted into and entitled to all the advantages of this union, but no other colony shall be admitted into the same unless such admission be agreed to by 9 states. Article 12. All bills of credit emitted, monies borrowed, and debts contracted by or under the authority of Congress before the assembling of the United States in pursuance of the present Confederation shall be deemed and considered as a charge against the United States for payment and satisfaction whereof the said United States and the public faith are hereby solemnly pledged. Article 13. Every state shall abide by the determinations of the United States in Congress assembled on all questions which by this Confederation are submitted to them, and the articles of this Confederation shall be inviolably observed by every state, and the Union shall be perpetual, nor shall any alteration at any time hereafter be made in any of them, unless such alteration be agreed to in a Congress of the United States, and be afterwards confirmed by the legislatures of every state. These articles shall be proposed to the legislatures of all the United States to be considered, and if approved of by them, they are advised to authorize the delegates to ratify the same in the Congress of the United States, which being done, the same shall become conclusive. By order of Congress, Henry Lawrence, President. End of section 46. Section 47 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2, by Mercy Otis Warren. Thomas Paine. The name of Thomas Paine has become so generally known both in Europe and America that a few strictures on his character may not be uninteresting. Mr. Paine was a native of England, but he had resided in America some time before the American Revolution took place. He warmly advocated the cause of the colonies and wrote in the spirit of the times with much applause. Several of his bold publications displayed a considerable share of wit and ingenuity, though his arguments were not always conclusive. His crisis, his common sense, and some other writings were well adapted to animate the people and to invigorate their resolutions in opposition to the measures of the British administration. Though not generally considered a profound politician, yet as it was then thought he wrote on principles honorable to the human character, his celebrity was extensive in America and was afterwards disseminated in England, and his merit as a writer for a time appreciated by a work entitled The Rights of Man, which was replete with just and dignified sentiments on a subject so interesting to society. His celebrity might have been longer maintained, and his name had been handed down with applause, had he not afterwards have left the line of politics and presumed to touch on theological subjects of which he was grossly ignorant, as well as totally indifferent to every religious observance as an individual, and in some instances his morals were censured. Persecuted in England, he repaired to France, some time before monarchy was subverted in that nation. There, after listening to the indigested rant of infidels of antecedent date, and learning by rote the jargon of the modern French literati, who zealously labored in the field of skepticism, he attempted to undermine the sublime doctrines of the gospel and annihilate the Christian system. Footnote: the infidel has shot his bolts away, till his exhausted quiver yielding none. He gleans the blunted shafts that have recoiled, and aims them at the shield of truth again. Cowper. End of footnote. Here he betrayed his weakness and want of principle, and blasphemous scurrilities and impious raillery, that at once sunk his character and disgusted every rational and sober mind. It is no apology that this was done at a period when all principles seemed to lie prostrate beneath the confusions and despotisms of the Robespierrean reign. It is true, this insignificant theologian, who affected to hold in contempt all religion or any expectations of a future state, was at this time trembling under the terrors of the guillotine, and while imprisoned, he endeavored to ingratiate himself into the favor of the ruling faction of France by leveling his sarcastic pen against opinions that had been for ages held sacred among mankind. The effusions of infidelity, entitled The Age of Reason, would not have been thought worthy of a serious refutation, had not much industry been employed to disseminate this worthless pamphlet among the common classes of mankind. The young, the ignorant, the superficial, and licentious, pleased with the attempt to let loose the wild passions of men, by removing so efficient a guard as is contained in the sacred scriptures. This pernicious work was by them fought for, and read with avidity. This consideration drew out the pens of men of character and ability, to antidote the poison of licentious wit. No one had more merit in the effort than the learned, pious, and excellent Dr. Richard Watson, Bishop of Llandaff. His works have always been read with pleasure and applause by every man of genius, virtue, and taste, in whatever branch of literature he drew his pen. His observations on the writings of Paine, his letters to Mr. Gibbon, with a concluding address to young gentlemen, will be read with delight and improvement by every person who adores the benignity of divine government, long after the writings of infidels of talent and ingenuity are sunk into oblivion. Men of discernment are ever better pleased with truth in its most simple garb than with the sophisticated, though elegant style of wit and raillery, decorated for deception, and the name of Voltaire, with other wits and philosophers of the same description, will be forgotten, and even the celebrated Gibbon will cease to be admired by the real friends of the Christian dispensation, while its defenders will be held in veneration to the latest ages. The lovers of liberty, on reasonable and just principles, were exceedingly hurt that a man so capable, as was Mr. Paine, of exhibiting political truth in a pleasing garb, and defending the rights of man with eloquence and precision, should prostitute his talents to ridicule divine revelation, and destroyed the brightest hopes of a rational and immortal agent. Mr. Paine outlived the storms of revolution, both in America and in France, and he may yet add one instance more of the versatility of human events by outliving his own false opinions and foolish attempts to break down the barriers of religion, and we wish he may, by his own pen, endeavor to antidote some part of the poisons he has spread. End of section 47. Section 48 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2 by Mercy Otis Warren. Biographical Note Number 7. Count Kosciusko. Footnote: the Count Kosciusko was a gentleman of family without the advantages of high fortune. His education, person, and talents recommended him to the King of Poland, by whom he was patronized and employed in a military line. Early in life he became attached to a lady of great beauty, belonging to one of the first families in the kingdom. The inequality of fortune prevented his obtaining consent from her parents to a union, though the affections of the lady were equally strong with his own. The lovers agreed on an elopement and made an attempt to retire to France. Pursued and overtaken by the father of the lady, a fierce rencounter ensued. When Kosciusko found he must either surrender the object of his affection or take the life of her parent, humanity prevailed over his passion. He returned the sword to its scabbard and generously relinquished the beautiful daughter to her distressed father, rather than become the murderer of the person who gave being to so much elegance and beauty, now plunged in terror and despair from the tumult of contending passions of the most soft and amiable nature. This unfortunate termination of his hopes was one means of lending the celebrated hero to the assistance of America. Wounded by the disappointment, and his delicacy hurt by becoming the topic of general conversation on an affair of gallantry, he obtained leave from his sovereign to retire from Poland. He soon after repaired to America and offered himself a volunteer to General Washington, was honorably appointed, and by his bravery and humanity rendered essential services to the United States. After the peace took place between Great Britain and America, he returned to his own distressed country. Footnote: it was a question in a literary society afterwards in London, which was the greatest character, Lord Chatham, General Washington, or Count Kosciusko. Analytical Review. End of footnote. His sufferings and his bravery in his struggles to rescue his native country from the usurpations of neighboring tyrants, until the ruin of the Kingdom of Poland and the surrender of Warsaw, are amply detailed in European history. Wounded, imprisoned, and cruelly used, his distresses were in some degree ameliorated by the compassion of a Russian lady, the wife of General Kosciusko, who had been a prisoner and set at liberty by the Count. This lady could not prevent his being sent to Petersburg, where he was confined in a fortress near the city. But he surmounted imprisonment, sickness, misery, and poverty, and afterwards revisited America, where he was relieved and rewarded as justice, honor, and gratitude required. End of footnote. End of section 48. End of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2 by Mercy Otis Warren.